Welcome to the enchanting world of Bella Brown's historical Western romance. I'm delighted to share this journey with you today. Before we ride into the story, if you enjoy these narrations, please consider subscribing to this channel. It's a small gesture that makes a big difference, and your support makes it possible to continue bringing these heartfelt tales to listeners everywhere, completely free of charge. Now find yourself a comfortable spot, close your eyes if you wish, and allow your imagination to travel back to the American frontier where adventure and romance await. This audiobook presentation features The Bride's Fresh Start by Bella Brown. All rights reserved. Chapter 1. What a magnificent soiree! Eleanora Fletcher gasped as she stepped off the dance floor. Lacy Sinclair smiled, taking in the crowds around them. The ballroom was bursting at the seams with Boston's highest of society folk. For months, it seemed to Lacy that all of the well-heeled people in town had been scrambling to get an invitation to the calendar event of the year. Attending a New Year's party at the Bonds property was seen as a triumph, not least because people got to ring in the start of the year with the most handsome and wealthiest man in the town. For Lacy, at least, that was a guarantee. It certainly is, isn't it? You must be so excited. The wedding is only a few months away. You've got every girl in this room terribly jealous, you know. That's not why I agreed to marry him, Lacy reminded her. Oh, of course not, Eleanora exclaimed. I just mean that you're the luckiest girl in Boston. When we were growing up, I never imagined that we'd be going to parties quite like this, and just think that this will be a regular occurrence for you now. No more hoping to bump into someone who could put a good word in. Now you're the one who can grant the invites. Eleanora leaned forward to grasp her by her hand. And you know that I've always held you in the highest esteem, Lacy, dearest. She batted her lashes and fanned her cheek playfully. Lacy laughed along with her friend. She felt like the luckiest girl, too. Roger Bond could have chosen any woman he wanted, and there were unquestionably plenty of them who had put themselves in his way or had been put there by their parents. Lacy hadn't imagined that she would be the one to finally catch his eye, not when she came from a middle-class household. The Sinclairs were a respectable family with a solid reputation, having been rooted in Boston for quite some time, but the engagement announcement had been enough to set the entire social scene upside down for a while. I suppose you can thank that terrible governess of mine, Lacy replied, her lips twisting into a smile as she recollected her younger days. I always thought she was better equipped to train an army than a young girl. I didn't see why it should matter so much that I stood up straight or learned the perfect embroidery stitches. I don't think that's entirely true. After all, you often chose lessons with your governess instead of tea at my house, Eleanora sniffed. I know that your parents would have impressed upon you what your future station would be in life if you deviated from the path that they wanted for you. Lacy straightened, trying not to let the sting of Eleanora's familiarly barbed words show. It is a daughter's duty to make her family proud. They have more than enough reasons now, Eleanora murmured. Lacy didn't like to think of her good friend being envious, but sometimes she wondered if this was the reason for Eleanora's somewhat bitter tone, especially since the Fletcher family was a wealthier one than hers. It wouldn't do to point this out, so she tried to diffuse any animosity. You can't be too upset, Eleanora. You're here now, aren't you? And don't think I didn't notice that you and Alec Conray have danced several times. Eleanora's face flushed as her mouth curved into a self-conscious smile. It was a few chaste dances, that's all. But she leaned in once more and her eyes shone conspiratorially. I do hope that this new year brings in all sorts of wonderful things for us. My parents would be thrilled if I were to get engaged, and I can't think of a better place to find my future husband than one of the Bonds parties. As for you, you could be with child by the end of the year. Prosody. Lacy's mouth dropped open at the very mention of what would happen between a man and his wife after they'd wed. A gloved hand covered her mouth as manners dictated, and Eleanora cackled in glee. Lacy looked about her to ensure no one else had been privy to the crudeness. More than once, she'd allowed her mind to drift when she imagined a future as Mrs. Roger Bond. He was everything that a woman could want. On his arm, she would become one of the most influential women in the city. Others would want to use her dressmaker or copy her dinner menus. Why, they might even go get themselves a sweet little dog like her Percival, who was currently snoring contentedly on the hearth despite the crowd around him. She spotted Roger across the room. He was leaning in close to say something to Alec Conray, and the two of them burst into raucous laughter a moment later. Lacy knew it was probably some terrible male joke that would make her and the other ladies blush until they were as red as the rubies around Lacy's neck. She looked away, pretending that she hadn't seen. Men will be men, as her mother would say. There was nothing she could do about it. She couldn't train them in the same way she had her little dog, after all. The evening carried on, and Lacy watched as several of her friends were asked to dance and then returned to their seats. Everyone was laughing and dancing, gossiping behind their gloved hands about each other's gowns or who might be spending too much time with whom. It was all great fun, but when Lacy glanced up at the huge grandfather clock in the corner, she realized that it was nearly over. "I'd better go and find Roger," she explained as she rose from her chair and shook out the skirt of her gown. "He's been so busy socializing that the two of us have hardly had a chance to dance, and then what will people say?" The first to say anything, she knew, would be her parents. Mr. and Mrs. Sinclair were just a table away. Lacy, already engaged, and the host of the event no less, had the privilege of being seated with her friends. Her younger sister Polly glared at her as she walked by, jealous of the new standing that Lacy had earned with her upcoming marriage. The two of them had hardly talked since the engagement was announced, although they'd never been particularly close. Threading her way across the ballroom, Lacy expected to see Roger near the same men he'd been chumming around with all evening. She saw several faces she recognized, but not those dark brown eyes and the square jaw that had become so familiar. "Alec?" She tapped the shoulder of the young man Eleonora was smitten with. "I'm looking for Roger?" "Oh, He looked around at his friends as though they might be able to supply the answer. When none came, his eyes shot back to Lacy's and then away again. "I think he might have gone for a breath of fresh air. It's stuffy in here." "Right, thank you." Lacy hurried out of the ballroom and into the hall. She was just about to slip out the door and see if Roger was on the balcony when she heard the deep rumble of his voice off to her left. Following it, she stepped through the next doorway and into the library. Roger was there. He had not gone out for some fresh air, nor was he fetching some more cigars to share with the other men. He stood with his back to the doorway, the broad musculature visible even through his jacket as he leaned one hand against the mantel. He had one heel cocked, as though he was ready to dart to the side if he needed to. That deep rumble of his voice sounded again, but Lacy couldn't understand what he was saying. "No, Mr. Bond," came a feminine voice, far more distinct. "I've told you no 1,000 times now. Please, just let me get back to the kitchens. I only came in here to make sure the fire was still going." "Cecilia, you are in my employ." Roger's words were unmistakable now. "You spend far too much time in the kitchens, where I can't see your pretty face. Or anything other pretty parts of you, for that matter," he added as he dipped his head lower. Lacy's heart caught in her throat as he saw his hands squeeze the backside of Cecilia's dress. She turned away, not wanting to see it. Bile boiled in her throat, and she pressed her fingers to her lips as she slipped quietly from the room, Roger's husky laugh filling her ears. The image of his deceit was burned into her eyes even as tears cascaded over them. She didn't stop until she stepped out onto the balcony. The freezing night air greeted her, and she leaned over the balustrade, fighting against the sobs. It would do no good to cause a scene now. She straightened up as the muted cheers erupted inside the grand home. A new year had dawned, the year that she was to become Mrs. Roger Bond. She wrapped her arms around herself as one question filled her mind. Wasn't she enough for him? Chapter 2. "What's the matter with you?" "Nothing." Lacy picked at the lint on her dress as she gave her rote reply. Eleonora clicked her tongue. "I don't believe you. You've been in a funk for weeks." Lacy lifted her gaze to her friend, trying to hold her emotions at bay. How lovely it would be to air her concerns with another person. Her mouth pinched as she debated saying how she felt. Thinking about it, you've been somber ever since the party, Eleonora continued, eyeing her shrewdly. I think you've been staying up too late at night, dreaming of your wedding. Eleonora smiled as she lifted her teacup from the delicate saucer and pressed it to her lips. Not that I can blame you. I'd be doing the same thing. No, it's not that, exactly. Lacy's tea was getting cold, but she didn't particularly care. Her eyes felt heavy from lack of sleep. She was tired all the way down to her bones after lying in bed, wondering what she should do. She looked at her friend once more. What is it? Eleonora pressed. That's such a curious look you're giving me. Lacy swallowed and let out a soft sigh. Something terrible happened on the night of the party. Did Fanny Curtis say something about your dress? You know, she had her nose in the air all night long, remarking about how things should have been done differently for the party. Eleonora rolled her eyes and fluttered her hands in the air, as if she would know. The last party that she threw was a complete disaster. I didn't speak with her that night, Lacy murmured. Fanny Curtis's fashion opinions barely mattered a jot to her now. Eleonora set her cup down her a clatter and frowned. You're being most tiresome. What's wrong? Her friend's exasperation made her gritty eyes sting with unshed tears. It felt as though she'd been in a fog of uncertainty ever since the New Year celebration, holding back the tears and trying to put on a brave face for the world. I'm starting to think that Roger isn't much of a gentleman. Even as the words left her mouth, she felt a little of the tightness inside ease somewhat. Eleonora blinked. Why would you say that? It's a lot of little things, really. Lacy stood up and crossed the room to the window. She looked out over the street. She had been looking forward to having a different view to look at every day once she married Roger, settling into his home and running it as though she'd been born for it. Now the thought made her stomach curdle. For one thing, he isn't very nice to Percival. He kicked him last week when he was in the way. I'm sure that was an accident, Eleonora reassured her. After all, Percival is usually underfoot. You've tripped over him yourself. That was true, but Lacy wasn't convinced. Then there are all the lewd jokes he makes with his friends. That's men for you, Eleonora said with another roll of her eyes. Barely above beasts, even the finest of them. Yes, exactly. Lacy clasped her hands tightly in front of her as she turned around and faced her companion once again. She hadn't quite been able to say anything until now. It hurt too much, and saying it out loud would only make it more real. And I suppose that's why I found him groping a maid in his service on the night of the party. Eleonora's thin pink lips opened and then closed again. Her brow creased, and she frowned down at her teacup. When she looked up at Lacy, she'd arranged her face into one of delicate tranquility. I don't know about that, Lacy. Roger is the most eligible bachelor in all of Boston, or at least he was until he got engaged to you. Why would he bother doing something like that? That's a question I've asked myself numerous times, and yet I haven't found an answer. At the very least, I haven't found an answer that I like. But I just don't know that I can't marry him after all I've seen so far. It's just how men are, Eleonora shrugged. Lacy barely heard the defense of her betrothed. It's almost as though a veil has been lifted, and I've seen the unadulterated version of him. The other night, when he had no idea that I was there, made me realize just what a terrible man he really is. It threw light on everything else that I've been excusing away because he's Roger Bond, and I should be dazzled by him. She paced back and forth in front of the window, twisting her hands in front of her. There's no telling how many other women he might be flirting with behind my back, and what's my guarantee that he would stop once we're married? I think you're getting carried away. Eleonora countered softly. It was late. You were tired. You'd had a drink. That's fine. We were all celebrating. Her voice trailed off, and she picked up her teacup once more. Sit. Let's talk about something else. The wedding. Have you had any more replies yet? Lacy whirled on her, shock hitting her stomach as she stared at her friend. You don't believe me. It was a statement, not a question. I just don't think you should throw your entire future away based on a few moments. Eleonora replied delicately. After all, You've had yourself all in a tizzy over these wedding plans. You probably just need some rest. Rest wouldn't make the awful things she'd seen go away, nor would it make her believe that Roger was a good man. I've been resting ever since I came home from the party. That only gives me more time to think. It gives me time to remember that Roger has been cruel to his stable hand, blaming him for the fact that the horse had stumbled. There are countless other things, Eleonora, things that always seemed like something small at the moment, but that are all adding up. I've spent a lot of time with Roger, and I have seen his true character. Eleonora huffed out a laugh, her tone satirical. His character is that he's a man, Lacy, a handsome and wealthy man with contacts and a future. I'm to ignore this because of his status? You're to ignore it because you don't seem to realize just how lucky you are. Now sit and drink your tea. It'll soothe your nerves. Lacy bit back on the deep sigh. Eleonora's tone did nothing to soothe the tumultuous storm within. Perhaps her friend was right, and she was blowing this out of all context. She resumed her chair, but declined the tea. I wanted to marry for love, she said. If you say so. Eleonora took a sip of her tea derisively. Frustrated as she was, Lacy was happy when it was time for Eleonora to return home. It didn't make her feel any better about the situation, though. She spent the rest of the afternoon trying to distract herself, wondering if there was any chance that Eleonora was right, or if her friend simply didn't want to give up the chance to keep attending all of the high society parties. Her heart lurched in her chest when Roger showed up just before dinner. Lacy took a deep breath as she went down to see him. There was no reason to panic. She'd been feeling anxious, and she'd convinced herself of things that weren't true. She paused by the door of the drawing room and wiped her damp palms across her midriff, trying to calm the butterflies that fluttered there. She fixed her smile in place as she opened the door and held the door long enough to allow Percival to follow her in. Roger was standing in front of the fireplace. Tully. It was much the same stance that he'd had when she'd seen him at the party, with his palm braced against the mantel. She studied his back for a moment, pulling in another breath and reminding herself that it was quite likely she'd let her worries get away from her. "Good evening, Roger." When he turned, his eyes were dark and cold. Her smile faltered at the look he was giving her. "I don't know that I'd call it good. The day has been far from good. In fact," his tone matched the fury glinting in his eyes. "What's happened?" She moved closer to one of the armchairs, eager to sit down, but Roger's tense energy filled the room and kept her on her feet. Percival stood just at the hem of her skirts, looking up at her and waiting. "As if you didn't know," Roger spat. She locked her knees to ensure that she stayed upright. "I'm quite sure I don't know what has brought on this temper." "Imagine how you'd feel to know that your fiancé had been spreading salacious lies about you." Her heart bumped against her chest, and she placed a hand on the back of the armchair, pained eyes meeting his furious ones. She swallowed, trembling fingertips pressing against her lips to keep the gasp inside. She'd only spoken with one person about her true feelings in this very room mere hours ago. Yet still, her mind refused to acknowledge such a breach of trust from a friend. "Oh, now you have nothing to say for yourself?" he sneered. "You've been talking about me behind my back, Lacy. I have an exemplary record and I am an honorable man. How dare you try and smear that reputation with idle gossip?" "It's the truth," she said slowly. He let loose a bark of disbelief. "I'm sure I don't have to tell you what a terrible thing it is that you're trying to do. If you wanted out of the engagement, then all you had to do was to say so." Her breath caught. He was being so loud and everyone was going to hear. "Roger, please calm down. I cannot believe you would tell such lies about me." He threw his arms wide. "You can't possibly think that I would want to marry you after this. Any woman who would dare gossip about me doesn't deserve the privilege of being my wife." Lacy stared at him as comprehension finally dawned. He was performing, just as he always did. "My father isn't yet home, and Mother is upstairs getting ready for supper, so no one can hear you." He paused, his brow quirking as his tone lowered. "I ought to keep our engagement on just to spite you, and so I can make sure you're properly punished." Percival growled at her feet, and Roger bared his teeth at the little dog. I should have done more than kick you. Percival jumped forward and sent a sharp warning bark up toward Roger. Roger's hand rolled into a fist, though he did take a tentative step back from her. Keep the filthy little thing away from me, or else I'll make a rug out of him. Lacy had spent the last several days feeling as though she was lost, consumed with doubts and insecurity. Hearing the man who'd proposed threaten her little dog turned those ambiguous emotions to anger and defiance. She scooped up her dog, tempering those feelings, just as her governess had schooled her to do, even as she knew the man who stood before her deserved the full force of her ire. The Bond family was a force to be reckoned with. Clearly, Roger had taken the stance that attack was the best form of defense to save face in this situation. He'd been quick to ensure that everyone in society would be listening to his side of the story. "He's not filthy," she said calmly, "and at least he treats me with respect and dignity, which is far more than I've been getting out of you. Don't worry, Roger." Prosody rate. "I won't soil your reputation by marrying you. The engagement is off." Lacy. Her father loomed in the doorway, his expression a picture of astonishment. Behind him, one of the maids held his coat, expression aghast. Leaving them all spluttering, she rushed to the stairs. Uproar could be heard through the floor as she headed for her bedroom. She closed the door and leaned against it, uncaring that her parents were undoubtedly doing damage control. Lacy only clung more tightly to Percival. "Roger may be rich and handsome, but I'm afraid he's simply not marriage material. Don't you listen to a thing he said either. You're a wonderful little thing, even if you do get hair all over my gowns." Percival's cold, wet nose butted her under the chin as she finally gave in to her tears. Chapter 3. "What are you getting ready for?" Mrs. Sinclair swept into the room and blinked at her daughter. Lacy carefully pinned up one of her dark curls. She would have had a lady's maid to do all of this for her if she'd remained engaged to Roger. She'd hardly have to get her hands dirty for a thing. As she studied herself in the mirror, however, she knew it had been entirely worth the sacrifice to let him go. She'd much rather be styling her own hair until she was an old woman if it meant she didn't have to deal with the likes of him. "Have you forgotten? It's the Smalls' dinner party tonight." Her mother made a face. She was a stout woman, and the way she pressed her lips together made her look rather like a frog. "I'm afraid that won't be necessary. The Smalls would much prefer you didn't come." Lacy turned to stare directly at her mother instead of through the mirror. "That's ridiculous. You were the one who broke off your engagement with Roger Bond," Mrs. Sinclair reminded her. "You know just how much he did for our reputation. Without him, there are going to be plenty of dinners and parties that you're no longer able to attend." It was then that Lacy noticed her mother was dressed rather elegantly. "And what about you? Where are you going?" Mrs. Sinclair stepped up next to her, leaning over the vanity to adjust her hair in the mirror. "Have you forgotten?" she mocked. "I still have another daughter that I can present to society, and the Smalls simply said that they didn't want you to attend. Polly has plenty of options ahead of her, even if you tried your hardest to ruin them." Lacy popped to her feet so that she was out from under her mother's bosom. "I did no such thing. Polly can't complain in the least. My former engagement to Roger meant that she's been introduced to far more of high society than she ever would have been otherwise." She curled her fists at her side, furious that she was being treated like such a pariah. "Don't let your face get all red like that, Lacy. It's not becoming, and you'll need to use everything you've got to find someone who's willing to marry you now." "I hardly think it would be difficult. After all, I did everything I was supposed to do. I learned to play the piano and to sing." She ticked off these skills on her fingers. "My embroidery is impeccable, and I know everything there is to know about running a household or hosting a party. I would hardly think I'm the bottom of the barrel, Mother." Mrs. Sinclair plucked at her big pearl earbobs. They were fake, Lacy knew, but her mother would pass them off as real for as long as she could, in the hopes that one day she'd be able to afford the real ones. She only had to get one of her daughters married off to someone wealthy enough. "It's as I told you 2 weeks ago, Lacy. Rejecting Roger Bond is probably the worst thing you ever could have done. He was the key to everything, and you had him right in the palm of your hand. I see. So, I was to simply allow him to behave as he did, to turn a blind eye when he kicked my dog or put his hands on a maid, and where would that lead once the two of us were married? You've been reading too many of those silly little books, Lacy. Her mother dismissed her worries. Roger is a good man. He wouldn't sink so far as to dabble with the hired help. Lacy tilted her head as she gaped at the other woman. She knew that most people thought her a liar, but it was the first time her mother had come right out and said so. Is my happiness not worth anything to you? Not if it comes at such a steep cost, Mrs. Sinclair snapped. Have you not noticed how few letters and invitations come for you these days? Do you not understand that you're the very last person anyone wants to be seen with? You're like a social plague, Lacy. Anyone who associates with you, in turn, distances themselves from a very powerful family. Your father and I worked very hard to put you in front of the right people, to help the family steadily rise in class. You've sent us sliding back down nearly to the bottom. Polly is our hope now. You'll consider yourself lucky if she lets you come and live with her and her husband when your father and I are gone. Lacy felt tears welling in her eyes again. She tried to fight them. One plopped, warm and wet, down onto her cheek. Her mother had always been a harsh and cold woman, one who'd curled her lip in disgust every time Lacy's emotions had gotten out of hand. I'd much rather be a spinster than be married to a man who treated me cruelly. I'd say that you've very nearly achieved that wish already, my dear. Mrs. Sinclair checked her hair and nodded in satisfaction before she eyed her daughter coolly. We'll see how you really feel about that once the dust has fully settled. Now, if you'll excuse me, it's time for me to go. Don't wait up for us. Mrs. Sinclair swept out of the room, leaving the door open behind her. Lacy closed it firmly. She whipped off her jewelry and tossed it into the tray on the vanity. It wasn't about the Smalls and their fancy dinner. It would have been terribly boring anyway. It was that they were so terrified of Roger and his impact on their standing that they wouldn't even deign to associate with her. Did she truly mean nothing as a person? Was she only useful as a finger to put a ring on? She got herself ready for bed, but sleep eluded her. She tried to read a book, but her mother's taunting words kept interrupting her concentration. It was late when she heard them return. Lacy had been sewing by candlelight, but she quickly snuffed it as soon as she heard the front door close. She waited, holding her breath, hoping that nobody would come rushing in to tell her how wonderful the dinner was. Excited chatter filled the hall as Mrs. Sinclair and Polly chattered about everyone who was at the dinner and what they wore, but nobody knocked on her door. Relieved, she lit her candle again and continued reading. Of course, Lacy could only remain in her room for so long. The winter weather was chilly, but the sun was shining brightly the next morning. She opened her window and inhaled a deep lungful of air. I think I'll step outside for a bit today, Lacy announced to Percival. He was dozing near the fire, which was always his favorite spot. At the sound of her voice, the dog blinked his eyes sleepily. Not you, dear thing, she laughed. 1 foot out the door and you'll catch a chill. I'll go by myself, but perhaps I'll pick up some new yarn. There was a lovely knitting pattern in Godey's for a dog jacket, and I think you could use one. Everyone else was up by the time she went downstairs. Lacy wasn't surprised by this, as her parents were early risers. It was the general sense of activity and excitement filling the place that had her wondering if she'd missed something. Geraldine, what's going on? The housekeeper had been bustling through the hall with a tray of glasses, and she looked startled to see that Lacy was standing there. A suitor has come to see your sister, miss. I don't mean to gossip or eavesdrop, but I believe he's already worked out all the details with your father. She failed to keep the surprise off her face, but the housekeeper didn't dawdle. The glasses rattled as she waddled away, leaving Lacy reeling with the news. She supposed that she shouldn't be all that surprised. He postrent. Why else would her mother ensure that Lacy remained out of the way if there was a suitor already lined up for Polly? Lacy turned toward the drawing room, where she could hear the steady rumble of male voices, accented by the trill of feminine laughter. Her stomach had turned to water. She was desperately curious to know who had suddenly desired to marry Polly now that Lacy was out of the spotlight. For a moment, she considered slipping right past the drawing room door and heading outside as she'd planned. The cold air would feel wonderful on her cheeks, and she could give herself a few moments to forget her troubles as she did a little shopping. But Lacy knew that she'd never really be able to relax until she knew what was happening in there. Steadying herself, she pasted a smile on her face and pushed open the door. Her mother and father were sitting on either side of the fireplace, beaming. The round of drinks on the coffee table must have been the second one since Geraldine had already taken a tray away. Polly sat just to the left on the settee, and the man sitting next to her and holding her hand must be her betrothed. Lacy's heart stuttered as she recognized the way his hair curled over his collar and the sharp cheekbones as he turned to look back. Roger. Lacy blinked, wondering if perhaps she was having a nightmare that she simply hadn't been able to wake up from. "There she is," her father announced as he stood up from his chair. "I was just about to send someone for you so that you could share in the good news. Roger has proposed to Polly." Her gritted teeth were crushed so tightly together that pain shot through her skull. Her eyes moved about the group. The gloating looks from Polly and her mother, the happiness that shone from her father. But mostly, it was the arrogant smirk that creased Roger's face that pained her the most. "Is that so?" "Yes." Polly smiled smugly from the settee, curling her fingers more tightly around Roger's as though to keep Lacy from taking him back. "We had a long chat at the Smalls' dinner last night, and the outcome was only logical. After all, most of the plans are already in place. It will simply be a case of moving the date a little to allow for my dress to be made. Roger has suggested having one sent from Paris. Isn't it wonderful?" Paris? Lacy had declined such extravagance when there were perfectly good dressmakers right here in the city. She had to remember to close her mouth as her gaze swung around the room. "Yes," Mr. Sinclair chuckled, seemingly oblivious to the malevolence that rolled off his youngest child when she looked at Lacy. "It seems the two of them were just meant to be." "Wonderful doesn't even begin to describe it," Lacy said, her mouth pinching around the words. She was determined to keep her manners, even though everything inside her was revolting against it. How could her parents let this happen? How could Polly agree to it and be so excited when she knew exactly how Roger had treated her? "We're going to have a celebratory party next weekend," Mrs. Sinclair announced, lifting her drink in the air. It was early for champagne, but Lacy could see the bubbles clinging to the side of the glass. "It might be best if you were to go stay with your Aunt Charlotte that weekend. The guests might be a little confused otherwise." Lacy didn't miss the cold glimmer in Roger's eyes. He'd gotten everything he wanted. He'd ruined Lacy's reputation around town with little more than a few words. He'd saved face by not only finding another woman to marry right away, but had chosen Lacy's sister. No doubt a strategic move to add insult to injury. Now he'd even had the satisfaction of seeing Lacy being dismissed by her mother. Lacy wanted her sister to marry for love, to be so consumed by that love that it wouldn't matter where they lived or the clothes that they wore, as long as they were together. Polly was a beauty, but she deserved more than being used. She looked at Polly, needing to warn her, though the words froze in place when she was met with spite gleaming in her pretty eyes. "Lacy?" Her father's tones softened, and his concern was almost her undoing. "Aunt Charlotte will be expecting you." "Of course," she agreed coolly, even though a weekend with the tyrannical Aunt Charlotte was the last thing she wanted. "Now, if you would be so kind as to excuse me, I have some errands to run this morning." If any of the happy party thought it was odd of her to be leaving so early in the morning, they said nothing about it. It was as though they were too caught up in their own ceremony to notice the distress that they'd caused her. She snagged her hat and coat from the closet and let herself out via the front door, pushing her arms through the sleeves as she trotted down the steps. She charged forward down the sidewalk, hardly paying any attention to where she was going. This was impossible. She'd held the whole world in her hands just a few weeks ago, and now it was all dashed at her feet. To make it worse, her sister had picked up the shards of her dignity and kept them for herself. Lacy would never be able to show her face in society again. Her mother's prophecy of her being a spinster was bound to come true now. Not, Lacy thought, that it truly mattered. She was done with men. The real problem she faced now was what to do with her life. She passed by the general store and instantly dismissed going in when she saw just how crowded it was. Next came her favorite dressmaker's shop, but Lacy couldn't possibly bear to go inside. All of those beautiful gowns would be a waste on her, as far as her parents were concerned. Even a new bit of ribbon from the milliner was more than she dared to buy right now. Everything simply looked too happy and bright. Finally, she turned to the print shop. It was dark and quiet, and books were likely to be her only companion for the rest of her life. Her friends and family had abandoned her. If only she could leave Boston and never see it again, then she would grab that opportunity and never look back. As she skimmed through the books, barely even reading their titles, she knew that she didn't have many options. She could go to Aunt Charlotte, but her mother's sister was just as likely to chide her for throwing away a good future as anyone else. Without making a purchase, she stepped back out onto the sidewalk and ran straight into another woman. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I wasn't watching where I was going." Lacy stepped back and straightened her hat, looking at the other party to make sure they were all right. She instantly recognized the big eyes and round cheeks. "Cecilia?" "It's nice to see you, miss." The maid bobbed her head, her eyes taking in Lacy's disheveled state. "Are you well?" Lacy opened her mouth to reassure her that she was, but her throat closed off from a rush of emotion. She shook her head mutely as she willed her body to not betray her in public. Cecilia tugged her to the side and shielded her from passers-by. "Here," she said, and pushed a handkerchief into her hands. Lacy accepted the cloth and dabbed at her eyes, sending the young woman a grateful smile. "Thank you." "I heard what he did," she murmured. "He has no shame, Miss Sinclair, and I hope that I'm not speaking out of turn, but I should be the one thanking you." "Thanking me?" Stunned, Lacy shook her head. "Whatever for?" "I got in terrible trouble with the bonds after what you'd said. It seems that they wanted to blame me for telling stories, but I hadn't said a word. I never mentioned you by name. I know, I was dismissed regardless." Lacy's gloved fingertips touched her lips. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for that to happen." "No, it's all right," Cecilia insisted. "It's actually quite wonderful. My cousin was working for the Jansons, but she was about to leave due to getting married. They were desperate enough for a new maid that they didn't care much about my referrals. Mr. and Mrs. Jansen are an older couple, and they're incredibly kind. They don't demand much, and they treat me well. It also means I won't have to fend off Roger Bond's attentions any longer." "I'm glad to hear that." Lacy's hand drifted down to her chest as she tried to control her breath. At least she didn't have to feel responsible for ruining this young woman's life. "I'm afraid you're much better off than I am. I don't know what I'll be doing with myself now." "Here." Cecilia produced a thin newspaper from the basket over her arm. "Before all this happened, I'd been thinking about finding myself a husband and moving out west. I thought it would be the easiest way to get away from Mr. Bond without having to find another position. I won't be going now that I have the Jansons, but perhaps it would help you." Lacy took the paper and scanned the front of it. The Matrimonial Times. She'd heard of such things, but she'd never imagined needing it herself. After all, she'd been the darling of Boston society as soon as her name became associated with Rogers. That was no longer serving her well, and she'd just been wondering how she could leave this whole life behind her. "Thank you, Cecilia," she said genuinely. "Thank you very much. You may have just saved me." Chapter 4. "You've certainly been receiving a lot of letters." Polly stood with her eyebrows arched and her arms crossed in front of her. "I don't know why that should bother you so much," Lacy commented evenly as she tugged at the ribbon tied under her chin to keep her hat from blowing away. "You have a wedding to plan. That should be keeping you busy enough." "Oh, yes." Polly's lips curled up in satisfaction. "I've been spending a lot of time ordering clothes for my trousseau. I haven't needed to worry about linens, since those were already taken care of." Lacy pressed her tongue against the roof of her mouth to keep her face from showing how she truly felt. Those fine linens had been a part of her trousseau, beautiful bedding, and tablecloths that she'd picked out herself. They'd been swiftly taken away from her, along with all of her respect and dignity. Even the beautiful emerald earrings that had been their grandmother's were now being claimed by Polly to show the bonds that the Sinclair family wasn't as hard up as they may appear. I'm sure you'll be very satisfied in your new married life. Oh, I will, her sister assured her. It's just that as I've been out and about making all of these arrangements, I've seen you out as well. I'm surprised at how often you go to the post office. I know that you don't particularly have to worry about being a proper lady at this point, but one has to wonder what you're really about. Nothing you need to concern yourself with, Lacy restated, wishing her sister would mind her own business. She wasn't about to reveal her plans until it was necessary. She simply couldn't bear taking on more ridicule than she already had to endure. She started to move past her sister and then stopped. Slowly, Lacy turned. She knew that what she was about to say wouldn't change a thing. She'd already gotten herself in trouble by speaking up once, and it was only going to cause more trouble by doing it again. She and her sister had rarely gotten along, but Lacy still felt she owed her the truth. You really should know that Roger isn't the man that he makes himself out to be, she explained quietly, taking a step toward Polly. He knows how to manipulate people. I expect that's exactly what made his family so rich in the first place. Why can't you simply be happy for me? Polly retorted, stepping back and once again increasing the distance between them. You're just jealous because everyone is looking at you differently now. They certainly were, but this didn't have anything to do with that. Polly, please. I don't want to see you get hurt by him the same way that I did. The only reason he even agreed to marry you was to get revenge on me. What a terrible thing to say, Polly exclaimed. Roger is a sweet, dear man. It's not my fault that you couldn't see that in him, or that you'd rather sit by the fire with your dog than become a wife and a mother. You brought shame to our household, and you ought to be glad that I was able to remedy that. Lacy sighed. She'd known that Polly wouldn't listen, but at least she could say that she'd tried. I can't stop you from marrying him, and I won't try. I can only try to explain what he's done to me and hope that you'll listen. I should think not. Polly stomped her foot, looking very much like the petulant child Lacy had known in the nursery, who didn't want anyone else to play with her doll instead of a young woman on the verge of marriage. Are you determined to sabotage everything? That seems to be the case. The deep male voice made Lacy's blood turn cold. She turned to see Roger coming in from the foyer. Polly, my dear, don't listen to what she has to say. She's only trying to take away your glory because she's jealous of you. That's exactly what I tried to tell her, Polly sniffed. She looked up at Roger with adoring eyes. She wants to ruin the happiest day of my life. I won't let that happen, he said calmly. Now then, I'm very parched after the ride over here. Be a lamb and run to the kitchen? Of course, Polly chirped. She was gone in a flurry of skirts. Finding the whole thing sickening, Lacy turned to head up to her room. Roger stepped in front of her. He stood silently until she finally looked up at him. I hope you can see, Lacy, that rejecting me was the biggest mistake of your life. I know your family already thinks so, but fortunately for them, they've been so caught up in the fact that your sister has fallen for me that they don't seem to mind too much anymore. What about you, though? What are you going to do? Sit in the attic and knit sweaters for your dog. So Polly had not only been swooning over Roger, but she'd also told him about the handsome little jacket Lacy had made for Percival. She thought about defending herself with the fact that the pattern had been published in a popular magazine and therefore had probably been executed by dozens of knitters, but she knew that wouldn't do any good. She could only be thankful that Percival was safely stowed away upstairs. If it makes you happy to be so vengeful, Roger, then you go right ahead. Just know that it doesn't affect my life in the least. She pushed past him and went up the stairs. Lacy, his voice followed her. Only her good manners allowed her to pause, but she kept herself from giving him the dignity of her turning around to look at him. I think it affects you far more than you care to admit. You miss me. You wanted to marry me, and you dreamed of having children with me. Now you'll have to think about that while you watch your sister get married, and when you see her belly swell with my children. You'll think about what you've done as you find that you're shunned from even the simplest of affairs during the holidays. I was your only chance, Lacy, and you threw it all away because you were jealous of a maid. Her very bones trembled, but she couldn't let him think that he'd won. Roger had practically admitted to the very thing she'd accused him of, and yet he would only deny it once again should she try to say anything. She couldn't make anyone see the truth, nor could she stop Polly from marrying him. Humiliation slapped at her. Words were useless, and so she continued her climb up the stairs. Back in her room, which had become her refuge these days, Lacy ripped open the latest envelope she'd received. Polly was right. She had been getting a lot of mail. That was one of the reasons she'd started visiting the post office herself. It kept the household from knowing exactly what she was doing. My darling Lacy, I have so enjoyed writing to you these past few weeks. I can't thank you enough for the postal order. The ranch has been struggling this winter, and it was kind of you to help me. I hope it isn't too soon in our correspondence to ask, but if you could see fit to come to Colorado, I'd be very content to make you my wife. As I had explained in my advertisement, I need someone to help me run the ranch. I can't tell you what a comfort it would be to come in from a hard day's work to find you waiting for me. We can be wed as soon as you arrive. My only regret is that I don't have the funds just yet to send to you for a train ticket, but I'll do everything I can. Arthur Lacy sat still as she read the words once again. She and Arthur Davies had exchanged several letters now. She hadn't truly thought it could lead anywhere, but it had been a nice thought. After all, he was a good Christian man, seeking a wife to settle down with. He wasn't the top of Boston society, and he might not even be handsome, but right now, Lacy didn't think she cared. "Come on, Percival," she said as she grabbed the other letters out of her desk and fetched her valise. "We're going on a trip." Chapter 5. "Here we are, Percival," Lacy said quietly as she held her dog where he could see out the window. "What do you think?" His big eyes watched the Colorado landscape give way to farms, houses, and businesses as the train slowed and chugged into the station. He'd been a good passenger, content to sleep at her feet as long as he got to stretch his legs a bit when they made their stops. Lacy hadn't been entirely sure that it would be a good idea to bring him along, but neither could she leave him behind. The other passengers had given her a worried glance when they'd seen him, but he'd proven himself to be a gentleman when he didn't bark or whine. The wind whipped through her as soon as she stepped out onto the platform, but Lacy didn't mind. This was a new start, her fresh start, away from a hurtful past and the happy couple. She'd been determined that this year would be her best one yet. While this wasn't the way she'd envisioned it, she couldn't help but feel hope rising in her chest. She'd sent a telegram to Arthur to let him know she was coming and the train that she'd booked herself onto, and she hadn't even bothered to wait for a reply. There was simply no time if she was going to make her escape. She collected her valise and glanced around the platform. She'd described herself to Arthur in her letters, and he'd done the same. Lacy scanned the crowd for a man of average height with dark blonde hair and a solid build. She realized that could be nearly anyone here, but she would find him if she only waited a bit. Percival pressed himself against her skirts and squinted against the brisk wind that whipped through the station. When the platform had cleared, Lacy decided that Arthur must be running late. After all, he must have quite a lot to do on a ranch, and what if there had been some sort of emergency? She didn't know what that emergency might entail, but she imagined there could be all kinds of things he'd need to take care of on a ranch. She took a seat on one of the wooden benches and contented herself with watching the porters dealing with the aftermath of having the train pass through. She spotted a young woman a few seats away and sent her a smile to ease to worry that was etched on her face. The woman looked away. Lacy watched as she flagged down a porter, and he pointed towards an older man who wore the dark uniform that indicated he was the station master. They spoke for a few moments, and Lacy frowned as the woman shook her head vehemently and her voice rose, carrying on the wind. "No, no, you have the wrong man." The station master's gaze was kind enough when he shook his head, but his response was inaudible. The porter joined him, and they each had the same look of sympathy on their faces. "Arthur Davies? There has to be another in town. He said he'd be here." At that, Lacy's ears pricked up and she leaned forward, heart pounding in her ears. She found herself on her feet to ensure that she didn't miss the next thing he had to say. "I'm very sorry, miss. He hightailed it out of town a few days ago," the station master said. "He had to go because he was wanted by the sheriff," the porter added helpfully. "Whatever for?" the young woman asked, echoing the same question that was in Lacy's head. "It seems that he'd been taking advantage of a lot of ladies just like yourself. He'd write to a woman out east claiming he wanted a wife. He'd even get them to send him some money to help out on his supposed ranch." The station master said, "Arthur Davies doesn't even have a ranch." The porter shook his head in disgust. "But then why would he invite me to come out here?" Lacy asked, inserting herself into the conversation. It was rude, but she was past the point of manners right now. The woman turned around to look at her with tears in her eyes. "You were writing to Arthur, too?" "I'm afraid so," Lacy admitted, her heart thumping sickeningly. She'd thought this was her guaranteed chance at a new life, but she could feel the gaping maw of the future opening up at her feet. "Please, sir, what else can you tell us?" He lifted a hand in a helpless gesture. "I reckon he figured he could take whatever money you might have once you got here, but I can't say for sure. I didn't know the man well. He'd only been in town for a few months, and now I imagine he was just on the run from somewhere else." "But what are we, to do?" the other woman asked, her voice trembling. "I suppose that's up to you. We've got trains heading east later on today. If you're looking to stay in town for a while, you could always check in with Miss Betty. She runs a boarding house." He thumbed over his shoulder to indicate the way. The other woman surreptitiously touched her pocket. Lacy understood the gesture even without having to ask. Her train ticket had cost her more than a pretty penny to come to Colorado, but she hadn't considered the details or the etiquette about having an agreement with the man in question in place. Lacy had simply wanted a way out of Boston. She'd believed Arthur had been the answer. Now she had to think about finding the money to get back to Boston, with even more humiliation to add to her sorry tale. "It's a nice place," the porter said. "Reasonable, with good food. Miss Betty's pies are legendary in these parts." "That sounds good," Lacy smiled. "Thank you, gentlemen. You've given us much to think about. We'll have a chat and make a choice." She gave each of them a pointed look so that they retreated to the office. Lacy waited until the office door closed before she spoke. "My name is Lacy Sinclair. Emma Snyder." She sniffed as she held out her hand, clearly trying to keep herself together. "It's nice to meet you." An awkward silence settled on them. Lacy's mind was full of thoughts, tumbling over what her next steps would be. She could send a message home. Her parents would no doubt send the funds for her return travel, but she'd left Boston in a hurry. With little more than a note scribbled in haste, explaining that she'd met the man of her dreams and had fallen wildly in love with him. She'd deliberately kept it short and made it sound eager and adventurous so that it would shock them all. She'd have to return and tell them all the truth, that she'd be a big fool and had been duped. Roger and Polly would laugh it up all the way down the aisle. "I have no idea what to do. I don't have the money for the ticket." Emma's chin lowered when her cheeks diffused with red. "I sent the last of my money to Arthur, and he promised to see me right when I got here. Some story about the ranch struggling through the last winter, and he needed to buy feed." Lacy had read a similar story of woe. "I'm afraid we've both been caught up in a mess, haven't we?" "It didn't even occur to me that a man would do such a thing," Emma murmured, dashing at the tears that slid down her cheeks. "I have nothing to go back for. I was looking for a new life. My sister is marrying my ex-fiancé after I found him cheating on me." Emma's eyes widened as she took in the exquisite dress and the neat valise case and the small dog at her feet. "Someone cheated on you?" Lacy chuckled dryly. "Don't seem so surprised. Under the fancy clothes, we're all just the same people looking for happiness and validation, Emma. I didn't contemplate such an event either." Desisant. Now that I do think about it, I can see what a gullible clod I was. Arthur's letters were not very detailed. I could probably read them all over again and see right through them, but I don't want to do that right now. I was just so desperate to get out of Boston that I sent him a message to say that I was leaving. Had I waited a few days, there wouldn't have been a reply. With hindsight, perhaps I should have waited for him to confirm, but she shrugged and gave a little sad shake of her head. I scribbled a brief note to my family, threw whatever I could into this case, and I left. Thorny guilt niggled at her when she thought about her father discovering that she'd fled. "I'm sorry that this happened to you," Emma said. Lacy laid a hand on her shoulder. "My mother would probably say that I deserved it for acting so rashly. No one deserves such a horrid thing." Lacy looked along the street beyond the station. She would not think about her mother's reaction just yet. Everything felt too raw. She saw that same uncertainty reflected in her new companion's expression. Though she was shaken and disappointed, Lacy saw no reason for the two of them not to stick together. After all, it seems that they could both use a friendly face. "How about we go get some food at Miss Betty's and get out of this wind? We can rethink our plans in the warm." "What about your dog? Will he be all right?" Lacy glanced down at Percival, who'd wriggled into the folds of her skirts to shelter from the cold. "He will be. We all will be." Chapter 6. "There you are, my girls. You couldn't have timed your arrival at Miss Betty's any better, just in time for dinner." Miss Betty put a heavy plate of food down in front of each of them. "Breakfast will be ready in the morning, but don't dilly-dally. Anything past 9 in the morning, and you'll be waiting till supper time to eat again. There's a couple of eating places in town. They serve the train passengers mostly. I run this place by myself mostly. I have a girl in the kitchen to help with dishes and laundry, but I don't have time to serve up 3 square meals. Lord knows I would if I could. I cook from the heart. Your rooms are at the top of the stairs and to the right. I put you right next to each other." "Thank you very much," Lacy said genuinely. "I can't tell you how much your hospitality means to me. To both of us, I think." Emma nodded her agreement, although she still looked rather forlorn. "Oh, now, that's how it is here at Miss Betty's. Everyone is welcome. We do get all kinds coming through. I won't turn anyone away. The Lord tests us, and I believe that He sends people to me so that I can bring them back into His light, even if it isn't an easy task. I do my best to help them." Miss Betty put a solid hand on the back of Lacy's chair as she eyed them. "That said, I do expect you girls to be going to church on Sunday morning if you're staying in town that long." Lacy hadn't particularly thought about how long she was going to be staying. Knowing that she would return home with her tail between her legs filled her with dread. How could she face everyone back there? Just thinking of her mother's beastly gloating was enough to make her shove the thoughts away. But neither could she sit at the railway station for the rest of her life. "We will," she promised. A huge bear of a man passed through the room, his voice rumbling through the wide chest as he murmured a greeting to them all. Emma visibly shrank in her chair as she stared at the retreating broad back. "You really did mean all kinds," she whispered into the plate of food. Miss Betty chuckled. "He looks like a beast with that thick beard, but he is a pussy cat. He's up at the timber yard, looking to fix part of the—" her hand performed a round shape in the air. "Whatever it is that has busted itself. He's from Montana. Apparently, he's quite the expert." The door closed and Emma's shoulders relaxed slightly as she picked up her fork. "You're safe here, Emma. I won't stand for anything untoward under my roof. Folks behave themselves here, or they get the sharp end of my boot, or the law, whichever is called for at the time. I do have a rifle here, just in case. It was my husband's. God rest his soul, but I could shoot straight long before I could walk." Emma balked at the mention of a gun, and her gaze zipped about the room. Their hostess looked down at her with sympathy and smiled. "I'll let you get to your food. It looks like you both need it. I've seen more meat on a butcher's pencil. Just let me know if you need anything." "Seamus, it's good to see you again," she yelled to a man across the room. Emma giggled and ducked her head a little. Goodness, she's quite the character. Though her circumstances dictated that she do otherwise, Lacy found herself smiling. "I rather like her. She seems to truly care about everyone here, even though they aren't blood relations. That's more than I can say for my own family." "Did they treat you poorly?" "Oh, I'm sorry. I shouldn't pry." Emma ducked her head again. "It's quite all right. We're birds of a feather, I think, seeing how we both ended up here at the same time and for the same reason." Atrocity. Lacy was taking great comfort in Emma's presence as well as Miss Betty's. She, at least, had no ulterior motive in being her friend as Eleonora had. That thought made her heart shatter a little bit, knowing that everyone in Boston cared more about how she fared on the marriage market than how she felt. If I can be concise about it, I discovered that my fiancé was a terrible man and ended the engagement. He responded by ruining my reputation among society and even my family, and then he concluded his revenge by engaging himself to my younger sister. "Oh dear." Emma pressed her napkin to her mouth, her green eyes wide. "That's awful. And what about you?" Lacy prompted as she delicately cut into a hunk of roasted chicken. The plate had been hastily loaded down with food instead of carefully prepared and presented, but she was grateful for it nevertheless. "What brought you here?" "My parents passed when I was very little, and I've been under the care of my Aunt Myrtle for a long time. She's not getting any younger, and she decided it was time to marry me off. I told her I wanted to marry for love or not at all, but she grew quite angry with me for being so impractical about it. She insisted that I marry a distant cousin who was nearly her age. I couldn't bear it, and so here I am." Emma's cheeks reddened. "Only now, I'm not married, and I'm in the middle of nowhere. I'm not sure what I'm going to do." "Neither am I, but I'm sure we'll figure it out." Lacy knew her strength and conviction only came from having someone else that she needed to care for because Emma was rather like an injured bird that fallen from its nest. "Neither one of us can go home, so at least we know that option isn't on the table. I suppose we'll have to find jobs." "Perhaps Miss Betty knows of some place that's hiring," Emma replied, a hint of hope in her voice. Yes. She had only known the older woman for a few short minutes, but already she knew she would help in any way she could. For the moment, we have a roof over our heads and food in our bellies, so things aren't really that bad. She was trying to convince herself just as much as Emma. Later that evening, she sat in the tiny bedroom she'd rented from Miss Betty. Her hostess had been generous enough to provide paper and ink when she'd asked for it. She no longer had the beautiful desk that sat in her room at home, but she would make do. Emma's comment about finding work had set off a chain of thoughts. Perhaps there was a way that she could forge a new life here and have a fresh start after all. Hadn't many women found paid work by cleaning homes or mending clothing? Why couldn't she be one of those women? She'd never been afraid of hard work or of getting her hands dirty. She thought of Cecilia and how she'd found her way after losing her job at the Bonds house. It took her a while to figure out how she was going to start this letter. "Dear Mother and Father, please accept my humble apologies for leaving without proper notice or a full explanation. I do hope that I didn't cause too much worry. I'm writing to let you know that I've arrived at my destination safely with Percival. As I said, I've gone west to marry. You were very clear and correct that there were no marriage prospects for me back home, and the last thing I would want is to be a burden on the family. Therefore, I've taken practical matters into my hands. I'm now happily wed to a rancher by the name of Arthur Davies, and the two of us are very happy together. All is well. Do tell Polly that I wish her all the best on her wedding day. Love, Lacy." Shame burned hot inside her, for this letter was a lie in its entirety. Percents. She wasn't sorry if she caused any worry, and she doubted that anyone had even noticed she was gone, considering how abuzz they were with Polly's engagement. She couldn't bear to have their judgment sitting upon her shoulders once more. They would only shake their heads and chide her for yet again making a silly decision. She couldn't face going back or seeing Roger and Polly live out their lives together. Seeing no other option, Lacy sealed the letter. She would start a new life for herself, just as she'd planned to do. It wouldn't be the one she thought would be coming to her, with marriage to Roger and babies on the way. She didn't know what this new life would hold for her, except for one thing: she was done with love. Chapter 7. Carter Gray lifted his eyes toward heaven, though he was starting to think nobody could hear his prayers. He sighed and looked at his daughter. Then he looked at the tall, slim man who had guided her in by the shoulder. "What did she do this time, Sheriff?" Sheriff Whitecotton let go of Alice and glowered at her. "She was caught trying to steal chickens." Carter's heart dropped into his stomach. "Stealing chickens? Heavens, Alice! What would make you want to do a thing like that? We have plenty of chickens, more than enough to produce all the eggs we need." Alice, at 10 years old, was the spitting image of her mother. She had Anne's dark hair and eyes, and she had the same petulant mouth. She even made the same expressions. The angry one on her face right now was quite familiar, as he'd seen it more and more often these days. "I wasn't trying to steal them," she countered. "One of them had an injured wing, and I was trying to help it. Mr. Denton is a silly old goose who doesn't deserve to keep animals in such a poor state." Alice clenched her fists at her side. "Alice," Carter ground out, "that's enough. You know better than to take something that doesn't belong to you." "I didn't steal, Pa." "You can just open someone else's gate and mess with their chickens," the sheriff chided. "People take that sort of thing seriously around here, considering that might very well be their livelihood. It's called trespassing, for a start." "You weren't even supposed to be out," Carter reminded her, though he could see by the angle of her chin that he wasn't getting through to her. "You were supposed to be here helping me. I can't run this whole place by myself." He looked out over the sea of hungry diners. He was lucky that his small business, Gray's Eating House, had been as successful as it was. He knew part of that was because Miss Betty always suggested that her boarders come to him for their lunch. There were also plenty of miners, lumberjacks, and ranchers nearby who'd rather not cook for themselves. Mostly, the people who came over from Miss Betty's were a strange mix of travelers. Some were just stopping on their way through to California, and the rare few were trying to get back east. They might be looking to stake out a piece of property, or they might just be looking for a new life in a new place. Carter had never paid as much attention to them as Miss Betty did. He only knew that they were here to eat, and he could make that happen with a little bit of coin. One new arrival, however, had made him wonder. The dark-haired woman had shown up a few days ago at lunchtime with a younger blonde woman. She had walked in with the other boarders, so he knew she was one of Miss Betty's gang. She stood out instantly to him with her striking looks and impeccably polite manners. People were rough out here in the West. If they had any refined manners, they lost them quickly as they were faced with survival. This woman was entirely different. Just now, she sat in the far corner with her fair-haired companion. Her dove-gray dress accented the blue-black tint of her hair and the deep blue of her eyes. She didn't look like she belonged in this hilly little mining town. "I don't like working here," Alice reminded him, bringing his attention back to the matter at hand. This had become such a routine thing to hear from her that Carter thought she probably even recited it in her sleep. "All I do is take out full plates and bring back empty ones." "Neither do you like going to school," Carter reminded her. "Every time you were supposed to walk to the schoolhouse, you'd find something better to do and wander off." "Prosody otter." "I didn't wander off," Alice argued, "and I do think catching a whole mess of fish was something better to do than sit in that stuffy classroom and listen to everyone argue over whose turn it was to sweep the floor." Carter rubbed his hand over his face and gritted his teeth. There was no winning with this child, and he was starting to fear that there never would be. She was stubborn and determined. Those qualities would be just fine if she'd implemented them the right way, but Alice had no intention of doing so. If only Anne hadn't left him here alone. She'd know what to do, but God had brought her home. Carter could take small comfort in knowing that she no longer had to suffer from the illness that had taken over her body, but raising a child wasn't a task for one man. Go into the kitchen and clean up. You've got feathers in your hair. Stir the soup, and then start ladling it out into bowls. I'm running behind, and this isn't helping. Fine. Stomping loudly, Alice stormed into the kitchen. I'm mighty sorry about this, Sheriff, Carter started. I know, White Cotton interrupted. You're sorry every time it happens, Carter. I gotta tell you, I'm getting about done with having the same sorry conversation about your girl. When is it gonna end, Carter? She's only 10, and she's getting worse the older she gets. Carter looked back at the kitchen and heard the cutlery clattering as Alice made her feelings known to everyone within earshot. He held back the excuses that wanted to leave his mouth. I've known you for as long as you've been here. Heck, I remember that little bundle that Annie proudly showed off to the town as though it was yesterday. The sheriff leaned in so that his words were only heard by Carter. The language I heard her using to Old Man Denton was enough to make me blush. Carter grimaced. She has to be here with me during the day. Some of the language that she's heard off the ranch hands can be colorful. Cottonwood clapped Carter on the shoulder. You've done a good job, Carter. Anyone can see that she's a handful, but she needs taking in hand. And I got more important things to do than calm down John Denton, who almost popped a vein when she called him a... Carter lifted a hand. I can fill in the blanks, Jake. Thanks. I'll speak with her, but she has a way of disappearing faster than a shadow at noon. I'll make sure that she knows she's crossed the line. No offense, Carter, but I have my doubts that she'll listen. She's earning herself quite the reputation as a troublemaker, and there's no telling where that's going to take her as she gets older. Pardon me for saying so, but I think she needs the guiding hand of a mother to calm her down. Sheriff Whitecotton gave him a knowing look. I'm not about to go and get myself married, Carter quickly countered. He'd already had this discussion with a few other people about town, but the answer was the same in his heart. I can't imagine being with anyone other than Anne. Jake Whitecotton sent a pointed look toward the kitchen when something shattered on the floor, and that was shortly followed by a string of cussing. I'm not saying you need a wife. She needs a woman to show her how a young lady should behave. Hire a governess, for crying out loud, something to tame that girl down before I have to lock her up. I'm asking you as a friend. Right. Carter nodded, seeing that Sheriff Whitecotton was only looking out for him and Alice. I'll see what I can do, although I doubt there are very many people around here who'd be willing to do that. You said yourself what a reputation Alice has. Prosody. So get someone who doesn't know about that, the other man replied with a wink. Not everyone has been here long enough to know. I'll see you later. Carter's eyes drifted back over to the pretty woman in the corner. He didn't know so much as her name, but what he'd seen had spoken volumes. She'd used impeccable manners when he'd placed food in front of her. She'd smiled coyly through her lashes as she gently rebuffed requests for her to accompany the more daring young cowpokes who'd spotted her in the corner. He knew that she ate gracefully, not spilling so much as a crumb on the tablecloth. She'd even requested a napkin. A napkin. Her back was ramrod straight and her ankles crossed, and she sipped her tea as though she was dining with royalty instead of rough lumberjacks in the foothills of the mountains. She was refined, delicate, and polite. She was everything Alice wasn't. Chapter 8. Your offer has come at a most fortuitous time, Lacy explained, as she stood in the entryway of the gray home looking about her. May I set the dog down? He's house-trained. It had been a full day since Carter Gray had introduced himself at his eatery and asked if she might be interested in a position in his household. Her heart had fluttered when she'd seen the deep shade of his eyes that matched his surname, but she'd quelled it immediately. Lacy needed a job and a steady income, not to grow all misty over the fluttering in her belly when he'd smiled at her agreeing to visit his home the following day. I've only been in town a few days, and I happen to be looking for work. Funny how these things sometimes work out, he replied genially as he shut the front door. though the people at Miss Betty's are usually here because they have work and are waiting to settle in the town, so maybe we could call it a lucky guess." His eyes dropped to the fluffy brown dog in her arms. "Is he yours?" "Yes," Lacy smiled. "His name is Percival." Carter rubbed the small head gently before he took her coat and hung it on a stand in the corner. "Tell me, do you have any experience as a governess? A teacher?" "I'm afraid not," she admitted, "other than the fact that I had a governess myself. She was very strict and effective." He nodded at this. "Please, step into the parlor. Can I offer you some tea?" Lacy knew that the poor man probably already spent the majority of his day racing back and forth to serve others, much as she'd seen him at the eating house yesterday, working hard to ensure that his customers received their plates promptly and that their food was hot. He'd answered the door at the address he'd given her himself. No staff, and the coating of dust on the mantel that she could see suggested that there probably wasn't anyone else. "No, that's quite all right. Thank you." "Please, sit." He directed her to a chair and took one opposite her. He waited until she'd settled Percival on her lap. "I feel I should be honest with you. My Alice has been quite the handful. Her mother passed away when she was barely 3 years old, and though I've tried my best to keep her reined in, she seems determined to buck against every rule I set in place." Lacy recalled her governess saying very similar things about herself. "I'm sure many children are like that for a while. How old is she?" 10, he admitted. "You probably heard her antics in the kitchen yesterday after the sheriff brought her back." Lacy recalled seeing the red-faced child being escorted into the eating house yesterday, though hadn't paid her much heed. Carter smiled when she kept quiet. "I know I should have found someone to take care of her a long time ago. I had enough hubris to think I could do it myself. Her defiant attitude tells me that I was wrong." There was something about Carter Gray that was particularly calming as he sat there in his armchair and spoke to her honestly. He didn't march about the room, yelling commands or boasting about his latest accomplishments. Neither did he treat her as though she were merely another piece of furniture. He was calm and quiet, but he was asking for her help. 10 years old is a difficult age, from what I can remember, she admitted. She probably feels as though she's old enough to make her own decisions, and yet she's young enough that she still wants to be taken care of. His pale brown eyebrows lifted in surprise. "For someone who says they have no experience as a governess, you certainly sound as though you know what you're talking about," Lacy smiled. "It's only that I remember what it was like to be that age." He had pressed in front. Her own governess had said a few things about her that were very similar as well. "If you're amenable to it, I'd like you to start immediately. There's a room for you adjacent to the nursery, which means you won't have to spend your money at Miss Betty's. Meals are, of course, available at the eating house." His brows lifted again, but this time in hope. If he was trying to convince her to take the job, then it wasn't needed. Lacy's situation demanded that she find some way to keep herself, and as this was the only one currently at hand, she wasn't going to say no. "I'd be happy to, as long as you don't mind that my dear Percival stays with me." Carter's eyes dropped to the bundle gently snoring in her lap. "Alice loves animals, so perhaps that would be a good idea," he said after thinking for a moment. "Very well. When should I meet your daughter?" "She's upstairs." She wasn't best pleased over this latest development in her life. His eyes dropped to his linked fingers, and Lacy got the distinct impression that the argument between them had saddened him. "Do you mind if I go up and introduce myself?" He stood up, matching her action. "Of course, but she is a good girl. She's just a little rough around the edges." Lacy wondered at the euphemism. Rough about the edges. It was very clear that he loved his daughter because he was trying to help her. From the brief chat that they'd had yesterday, she knew that Alice had had a few problems, but she'd been so bowled over by his offer, as well as the man himself, that she'd quickly dismissed any misgivings. "Very well. Her room is the last on the left." He gesticulated at the stairs. "Again, thank you very much, Mr. Gray. I'm sure everything will work out wonderfully." "I certainly hope so," he muttered quietly as she left the parlor. Lacy's heart jumped in her chest as she climbed the stairs, Percival at her side. How strange it was to be embarking on this new life, one that was so different from what she'd imagined. Roger would have a heyday if he knew that she was to take up a paid position in a household instead of being the lady, but she wouldn't be the one to tell him. Upstairs, she easily found the suite of rooms at the end of the hall. She gestured for Percival to sit and wait. The door was left open a crack, and Lacy knocked softly. "Hello, Alice." The door swung open, startling her to reveal a young girl. Her dress needed a wash, and her room left much to be desired. Clothes and toys were scattered about, and not even the bed was made. Her hair had been pulled back into an efficient braid, but the numerous strands that had been pulled out of it suggested she'd been running through the wind. "What?" came the surly retort. Her own governess had taught Lacy to be polite no matter the circumstances. She ignored the messy room and the wild hair and even the angry look on Alice's face. Her brows slid up, but she refrained from correcting Alice. There would be time enough for that. "Hello, my name is Miss Sinclair." Alice's response was a sullen shrug. Lacy was struck by an idea. "But you can call me Lacy." She could tell that got a bit of a reaction when the action stilled momentarily, but then she returned to her whittling, the shavings dropping unheeded onto the dusty floor. "I'm your new governess." "I don't want a governess," Alice replied stubbornly. "I didn't want one either," Lacy countered gently as she stepped into the room. "Mine was a grouchy goat with hairs on her chin," she admitted, which earned her a lip twitch. She continued, "But she taught me how to behave well and how to be a proper lady. Everything that she taught me has served me well as I got older. Childhood is fun, but we all grow up eventually." Alice sighed and rolled her eyes, and it was obvious that she truly had no discipline at all. "Yes, and then we all become boring adults who don't pay any attention when someone speaks to them." Such a prickly attitude deserved correction, but Lacy felt herself freeze. She certainly understood what it meant not to have someone listen to her. Otherwise, all of this business with Roger would have been completely different. "I'm very sorry that you feel that way," she said carefully, "but perhaps you'll be the type of grown-up who doesn't do that." "I don't want to be a lady," Alice pressed on, her little face getting redder, and Lacy could see that she was fighting tears. "I want to ride horses and raise cattle. No one listens to me. I don't want to get married or drink tea. Drinking tea is for sissies. I drink tea, you know, but I wouldn't class myself as a sissy." Alice snorted and slapped her penknife and carving on the window ledge. She folded her arms and glowered through the glass, remaining mutinously silent. "I also don't want to get married either, though I couldn't picture myself riding horses and rounding up cattle." Alice's gaze slid over to her, eyes narrowed. "You don't want to get married?" Lacy pursed her lips as she surveyed the chaos before her. "Most certainly not. So you can see we have something in common already, and we've only just met. All grown-ups get married and make babies. It's what everyone has to do." Lacy dipped for a piece of clothing strewn on the floor and held it up. A shirt that needed mending. "Not always. Sometimes we make our own path. Why else would I have left my old life behind and come here? I chose differently from what I was told I should do. Now, let's start with getting this place polished up while you tell me a little bit about yourself." The girl eyed her carefully. "What would a lady like you want to know about me?" Lacy picked up a blouse from the floor and shook it out. It was impossible to tell what might be clean or dirty in this mess, so she would have to assume they were all dirty. Alice would be getting a lesson on laundry very soon. "We're going to be spending a lot of time together. Anything you'd like to tell me would be grand. For instance, do you like to read? Do you play any instruments?" "Shh!" Alice flipped her hand through the air, dismissing either idea. "I don't want to sit inside and do boring things. I like to go outside. I like animals." "Oh," Lacy straightened, giving her new charge an interested look. "Do you now?" "Yes, but I suppose you're going to tell me that a lady shouldn't have anything to do with animals." Alice crossed her arms firmly over her chest. "On the contrary." Lacy gave a short, quick whistle. Her parents had never liked the sound, but it had worked incredibly well for Percival's training. The little dog came trotting in. He panted happily as he looked around, and then made a beeline for Alice. The girl fell to her knees and pulled him into her lap while he licked her chin. "You have a dog? Oh, he's wonderful. And look at his little jacket. He looks so silly." "This is Percival," Lacy said, making the introductions. "He's a very good boy. Do you like him?" "Of course I do," Alice exclaimed as she scratched behind his ears. The smile on her face was far better than the scowl Lacy had originally found. "I think he likes you too." "Can I take him outside to play?" Alice asked eagerly. Healance. Though she didn't know much of anything about being a governess, Lacy did know that had one piece of leverage over this stubborn girl. Only after this room is clean. She was not a gambling woman, but Lacy would be willing to bet that Alice had never moved so quickly to pick up her mess. Chapter 9. Carter scrubbed at his face with both hands, then shoved them back into his hair. His eyes were gritty, and his back ached from leaning over the accounting books for the past few hours. A glance at the clock told him that it was past supper time. He'd been able to work without interruption or a knock at the door from an irate neighbor for more than a month so far. It was a strange feeling. He'd gone past the stage of expecting the trouble to continue, but things with his daughter and his new employee seemed to have finally gotten onto an even keel. He rose out of his chair and used the lamp to see his way through the house into the kitchen. He stilled when he saw a plate of food had been left on the countertop for him. Alice had been grousing about the cooking lessons that had been conducted when he got in earlier, patiently guided by Lacy. All must have gone well, because his house wasn't a charred mess. He sniffed at the food, noting the blackened edges with a small smile. Just like Anne, he mused. When he finished the plate and washed it, he took his oil lamp out onto the porch, drawing up short when he spotted Lacy leaning against the post at the corner of the house. He almost went back inside, as she looked so deep in thought, but she must have sensed him because her gaze snapped round. She blinked to hide her startlement, hand on her chest, and she gave out a breathy laugh. "Sorry, I didn't mean to frighten you." "It's fine. I'll leave you to it." He started to retreat, but she stopped him. "This is your home, Mr. Gray. I should be the one to go out of the way. I was just enjoying the quiet," she said, looking beyond the modest yard to lands that stretched to the hills in the daylight. The evening was drawing in, turning a deep violet at its zenith, with stars winking out to show off their pretty lights. His gaze followed hers. "More than once, this place has given me solace." She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the cooler evening air. "I don't think I've ever been anywhere as still or as peaceful." Her tone was wistful, and he wondered what she'd been thinking about, or maybe whom she was thinking about. What had brought her here in the first place? He knew that she was one of the swindled brides, but what had prompted someone like her to leave the city for a place like this? He couldn't help the question that sprung to his lips. "Are you missing home?" He'd expected a denial, but her mouth twisted delicately, and his eyes were drawn to the fullness of her lips once more. "It's hard to miss something that you never felt a part of, but there is something that I'm wrestling with." His feet moved, and he joined her at the railing that spanned the porch. He set the lamp down, her dainty features thrown into relief in the twilight. She always seemed so capable, but right at this very moment, he sensed a vulnerability about her. "Is it something I can help with?" She smiled at him, and he could visualize shutters closing up when their eyes met. She didn't trust easily, and he wondered at the cause. "Thank you for the kind offer, but this is something that I must do myself." He inclined his head in acknowledgement. "I can listen, even if I can't offer any advice." "I'm fine, really," she replied and stepped back. "Alice left you some supper. I saw. It was surprisingly edible." He was treated to a rare laugh from her. "She has a good heart," Lacy replied, "but is as prickly as a porcupine." Lacy took a step back. "She'll get there. At least that's what I keep telling myself," she added. "I shall retire for the evening. Good night, Mr. Gray." Prosody. He watched the door long after it had been quietly closed behind her, and the gentle night settled around him. She dealt with his uncouth daughter as though she'd been doing this for years, and yet she'd only been working with Alice for just over a month. His daughter still had the quick tongue, and he was yet to hear any difference in the language, but Miss Sinclair and her little dog had settled nicely into his home. He sat on his bench and let out his breath. An ordered life was so tantalizingly close that he could almost taste it. So why did he feel as though there was still something missing from his life? Chapter 10. Lacy pushed through the kitchen door, nearly hitting Carter in the process. "Oh, goodness, sorry," she exclaimed as she jumped out of the way and looked to see if she'd made him drop anything. Fortunately, he jumped back quickly enough. No, it's quite all right. I'm glad to have run into you this morning, Miss Sinclair." Her stomach twisted around, wondering if her employment was about to be terminated. "If this is about the mud on the back porch, then I'm so very sorry, Mr. Gray. I'm doing my best with Alice. She is, as you've noted yourself, a very stubborn girl. She didn't want to come in to study. When she did eventually do as I'd asked, the mud was the least of my concerns. I had something else I wanted to ask you about before I head off to the eatery." Carter peered around the kitchen door to check the hallway. "She's not around?" "No, sir." Lacy watched him, confused and curious. He licked his lips as though deciding what to say. Could it be possible that I heard her playing the piano yesterday evening?" "Was it too loud?" she fretted. "I hadn't even thought about the fact that you'd just come home." Carter laughed, a pleasant sound that filled the kitchen. "You worry far too much, Miss Sinclair, but I suppose that's why I hired you. No, I was asking because I've never been able to get her to touch a single key. I swear I heard her playing what sounded a little bit like a scale." Realizing that he was happy with what he'd heard, Lacy relaxed. "Oh, yes, actually, she's just getting started. We're working in short increments at first because she is easily distracted." Lacy could only get the girl to sit still for so long before she went running off to find trouble, anyway. He ran his hand through his hair, mussing the tawny strands as he marveled. His eyes traced over Lacy's face as though seeing her for the first time. "That's wonderful, Miss Sinclair. I don't know how you're doing it, but I'm so pleased." She smiled at him, a reaction that she often found herself having when she was around him. Carter was just as calm and pleasant as the day she'd met him. She was yet to see anything that fazed him or made him speak harshly to others. His concern for his daughter's future and welfare remained steadfastly consistent throughout the process. There didn't seem to be any artifice about him at all. "I'm very glad you are. If it's all right, I was planning to work with her on her handwriting before she heads to the eating house this morning. That way, Alice would only have a short time sitting behind a desk before she lost her patience." "That would be just fine, Miss Sinclair. Just fine." Upstairs, Alice was just finishing with her clothing. "Do I really have to sit down and write a letter?" she complained. "It would be much easier to just go over to Sally's house and thank her for my birthday gift that way." "I'm sure that it would." Automatically, Lacy adjusted the ribbon in Alice's hair. "What would you do if Sally didn't live nearby? Many times, a letter is the only choice we have. I'll be writing a letter today myself." Alice turned around to look up at her in surprise. "You will?" "Yes. I'll be writing to my parents." It was something she'd been putting off for some time, but Lacy knew she couldn't do that any longer. Even if they'd treated her unfairly, her parents deserved to know the truth. "Let's get your inkwell. We can sit and write together." A short time later, the two of them were seated in the library where they could use the large table there to each work on their letters. Prosody rate %. Alice swung her feet underneath her in her chair and pressed the tip of her tongue to the corner of her mouth. It wasn't ladylike, but at least she was sitting still as she carefully wrote. Lacy could take what she could get and work on the rest later. At the moment, her current task seemed more difficult than turning Alice into a proper lady. Lacy's eyes drifted through the window, and she wished that she was outside, taking in some fresh air instead of the unpleasant task of telling the truth. "Dearest Mother and Father, I do hope that you're both faring well, and that the weather is as fine as it is here. Assuming you received my previous letter, I should like to let you know that my life in Colorado isn't exactly as I'd portrayed it for you. I did have the intention of marrying a rancher by the name of Arthur Davies, but I'm afraid I was swindled. When I arrived, The man I had written to had already absconded with what little money I had sent him, as well as that of countless other women. However, you should not worry about me. Your desire to see me raised with manners and education has paid dividends in this new life I have made for myself. I have found employment and am working as a governess in a local household. I had thought that marriage to a wealthy family was my dream at one point, but I see now that having a worthwhile vocation is far more satisfying to me. Though I humbly apologize for trying to tell you otherwise in my last letter, I also want to let you know that I am most pleased with my life. I have enclosed my address should you choose to reply. Your loving daughter, Lacy. She hoped that the explanation was enough. She didn't want to think about anything snide that may be coming back should her mother write back. She wasn't sure how her family would feel about her taking on a paid position when their youngest daughter would be linked to a powerful family such as the Bonds. Glancing over at Alice, she was just about to prompt her to correct her posture when a knock came at the door. "Keep at it," she reminded the girl who looked up. "I'll be back in a moment." A woman and a girl about Alice's age stood on the doorstep. The woman came charging in as soon as Lacy opened the door, making Percival retreat toward the stairs. "Are you Alice's mother?" she demanded. "No, ma'am. I'm her governess, Lacy Sinclair," she answered politely, though the other woman hardly merited it. "I'm Matilda Kogel, Jane's mother," she declared. "I'm sure you won't like to hear this, but Alice stole Jane's hair ribbon when she came over to play the other day. Now, I've tried to be very generous when it comes to Alice. I know that she's had some hard times, but that's never an excuse for stealing. I suggest her punishment should be swift and accurate." Lacy's blood thundered in her ears. Matilda Kogel cocked a brow in challenge when Lacy didn't reply right away. Instead, she clasped her hands delicately in front of her and smiled, her tone meek. "And how do you know that Alice stole this ribbon?" Jane opened her mouth to speak, but her mother didn't give her a chance. "Jane had it on her vanity before Alice came over, and then it was nowhere to be found when she left. Look, the little thief is wearing it right now." Matilda pointed a finger. Lacy looked, her jaw setting at the name-calling. Alice had just come in from the library, ink staining her fingers. She saw the effect of the harsh words hitting poor Alice like a brick. Lacy injected some steel into her voice when she looked at Matilda. "It is in poor taste to barge into a home and lay down accusations without proof," she stated evenly. "You don't need to get all hoity-toity with me. Prosody rate equals 7%. I know that you're one of those morons who paid that swindler." Lacy cleared her throat. "If you could temper your tone a little, and we can get to the bottom of this misunderstanding." "I didn't steal your ribbon, Jane," Alice said, anger firing out of her eyes. "I don't even like stew." She caught herself and took a breath, her tone dropping an octave. "I don't particularly like ribbons." "Nonsense," Mrs. Coggle huffed. "Every girl likes hair ribbons, and all of Jane's are brought in from a milliner in Denver, so they're some of the best. We wouldn't have any less." Lacy considered what she knew of her young charge already. She was wild and insanely stubborn at the best of times. She was willful and passionate and could sometimes do things without fully considering the consequences, much as a child was allowed to do. After all, they did have the life experience to know right from wrong just yet. But outright thievery for something so frivolous? It didn't seem likely. "Jane, would you mind if I ask you a question about your hair ribbon?" The girl shrugged, which earned her a harsh glance from her mother. "That would be fine," she replied politely. "What color is your ribbon?" Jane nervously met Alice's eyes. "The same color as that one." "The one that Alice is wearing." "Because it's Jane's," Matilda said snidely. "Yes?" Jane said with a nod. Her eyes slid over to Alice and then immediately to the floor. Clearly, Mrs. Coggle cared far more about this missing ribbon than Jane did. "And could you tell me, does yours have a small stain on one end from getting dragged in the mud out by the stables?" Jane's eyes went wide with shock. "Oh, no, ma'am. Of course not." "Right," Lacy said with a nod. "And did the other end have to be trimmed after a certain small dog got a hold of it when it was left on the floor and put a hole completely through it?" She gave Percival a look, but he only panted happily at her, having no remembrance of the incident. The girl shook her head adamantly. Definitely not. I see. Then I think you'll find that the ribbon Alice is wearing is not yours at all, Lacy concluded. I do very much hope that you find yours, though. But, humph, Mrs. Kogel snorted. I hardly find that to be any proof at all. How do I know she doesn't have Jane's ribbon up in her room, and that she stole Jane's because she'd ruined her own? Lacy gestured toward the stairs. I invite you to look if you'd like, but why would Alice be wearing the one she is if she had a far nicer one waiting for her upstairs? Mrs. Kogel narrowed her eyes and lifted her chin. I suppose there's nothing more that can be done about this for now, but rest assured I'll be keeping my eye out. Can I stay and play for a while? Jane asked, lingering behind as her mother headed for the door. Lacy smiled sweetly. I'm afraid Alice and I will be heading out shortly, but perhaps tomorrow would work? We'll see. Good day. Mrs. Kogel left, tugging Jane behind her. Lacy shut the front door and moved to the window to watch them retreat along the road. When she turned back, she found Alice staring intently at her. What's the matter? You believed me, Lacy smiled. Of course, a simple deduction and thinking it through logically. Jane lost the ribbon but didn't want to tell her mother. She told me so last week. Lacy tilted her head. She should add loyal to the earlier list. You could have told her mother the truth. Alice lifted her right shoulder. It's not my truth to tell. Lacy's heart cracked a little. But before she could say another word, Alice turned back to the library room to finish her letter. Chapter 11. Carter? The knock on his bedroom door jolted Carter out of deep sleep. He flew out from under the covers, tossed on his robe, and shoved his feet into his slippers. He'd heard the urgency in that voice, and it gave him that same shaking energy he'd used to get when Alice cried in the middle of the night. What is it? He said as he flung open the door. Lacy stood there, her dark hair plaited down her back, her house coat pulled tightly around her. Her face was pale as a ghost in the flame of the candle she carried. I'm so sorry, but it's Alice. His heart leaped as he imagined what she might have done now. She'd often slipped out from underneath him during the day. Surely she hadn't gone out into the cold night. She has a terrible fever, Lacy explained. She's asking for you. Oh, of course. Carter hurried down the hall and into his daughter's room. Alice lay there under the covers, illuminated by another candle at her bedside. Dark circles hung under her eyes, and he could see where her hair was plastered to her damp skin. She reached out for him as soon as he arrived. Papa, I don't feel good. I know, darling. I know. I'm here. He held her hand, which was far too hot and dry. Lacy went around to the other side of the bed and mopped the girl's brow with a cool rag. Percival, who had become quite attached to Alice, was struggling as he tried to find a way to get onto the bed with her. Poor dear, she's miserable. I'd go downstairs and make her some broth, but I don't want to leave her. I can do that. Carter squeezed Alice's hand. Lacy will be here with you. I'm going to make you some of my delicious chicken broth, the kind that always made you feel better when you were little. Okay, Papa. Thank you. Her lips were still pouty and sad as he left, wrenching his heart. You know, my governess used to sing to me when I was ill, he heard Lacy say softly behind him as he went out the door. Would you like that? Alice's mumbled answer could just be heard as he headed into the hall. The ghost of Lacy's lilting tune followed him down the stairs. In the kitchen, Carter worked frantically. There was a certain sort of urgency that came with cooking for an entire room full of people as he did at work all day. He wanted to make good food for his customers, of course, but the most important thing was that it filled their bellies and that there was plenty of it to go around. He always worked hard and fast, feeling a sense of satisfaction when another platter went out the door. Here, in his own home, he felt hollow and worried as he put the chicken carcass from the evening meal into a pot and covered it with water. Carter mindlessly chopped onion and some carrots from the cellar, trepidation needling him. A fever like this had taken Anne away from him. His wife has once sworn that his cooking was enough to keep a miner going for days, and that his chicken soup in particular was magic enough to bring someone back from the dead. But it hadn't helped her. Would it be enough for Alice? The kitchen door thumped quietly as Lacy stepped through. She brought her bowl to the pump and refilled it. "She's sleeping, so I thought I'd take the chance to get some cold water. It seems to help the fever, or at least it makes her more comfortable." Percival is curled up at the foot of her bed, so she's not alone. Carter's throat tightened as he studied her. He'd chosen Lacy out of a crowd because she was a proper lady, someone who could show Alice how to be dignified and polite. Those were going to be hard lessons to learn from anyone, and they would be slow in coming. He could see now that there were so many other things for his girl to learn as well. "I'm glad that she has you." She smiled at him over her shoulder and nodded toward the pot on the stove as he added a handful of garlic cloves. "Looks to me as though she has both of us." The stove and a lantern were all that lit the kitchen. Lacy looked soft and sleepy in the glow of the light. A strand of her dark hair wisped out from under her nightcap and fell across her cheek. Carter felt a warmth and comfort from having her there, and he knew that Alice did too. "She's got much more she can learn from you than playing the piano and writing nice letters. Those are accomplishments, but so is tenderly caring for someone, having the compassion to stay up half the night with them." Filling a tea kettle, she set it on top of the stove next to the pot before taking a tin of tea from the cupboard. "Don't you think she's learning these things from you as well?" Carter sighed and shook his head. His mouth hardened as he added salt to the mixture. "I've had to wonder, considering how badly she's behaved for me over these past few years." Mr. Gray, he didn't look up. Instead, he focused on the broth. "Lacy, we're here in our bedclothes. I think we've moved beyond the formalities by now." "Very well, Carter," her sigh whispered out. Hearing his name on those lips was enough to drag his gaze up. When he turned to her, Lacy's eyes were soft. "Alice has had a rough time, it's true. The rest of the town may see her as a girl who doesn't know how to keep her dress clean or randomly walks into a stranger's yard to deal with their chickens. But I see a girl who is honest to a fault, one who would never intentionally hurt anybody. She doesn't see the value in calligraphy or playing the piano. That may come with time. It may not. My sister certainly hated playing an instrument. Right now, Alice sees the value in doing what she feels is the right thing at that moment. She is learning how to trust her intuition. That may not be on the list of things a governess is supposed to teach her charge, but it ought to be. But she is much more than that. She is bright and oh so very clever. She has compassion and loyalty. She has a good moral compass. These are things that she has been shown by you and by her mother. These are things that she is born with, that are nurtured." He'd been so engrossed in what she'd said that Carter had hardly even realized she'd crossed the narrow span of the kitchen between them and had her hand on his arm. It sat there now, sending waves of energy through him that neither his body nor his mind knew how to handle. The air seemed to crackle and his blood thickened in his veins. He turned away on the pretense of stirring the broth. "Maybe so. Either way, I'm grateful to you." "For what it's worth, I'm grateful to you as well." She'd gone back to the tin of tea and was spooning it out into 2 mugs. "For the job? Yes, but it's become more than that to me. I came out here with the idea of getting married. I don't suppose I'd told you that. The man was a fraud, and I found myself stranded and with no idea of what I'd be doing next. You've given me a job, but also a purpose and a home." She moved next to him, but only long enough to lift the singing tea kettle off the stove. "I can't thank you enough for that." He stayed by the stove while she finished, though he was acutely aware of her movements behind him, waiting until he heard her slip through the kitchen door again before he tried to relax his shoulders. Lacy was a wonderful woman, not entirely unlike Anne. He hadn't been sure that women like her still existed in the world until now. She was all he'd hoped she'd be and more. So what did this warmth inside him mean when he knew it didn't come only from the stove? No, that was ridiculous. He could never care for someone the way he'd cared for Anne. She was the only person who had ever swept him up in the idea of love, even as a young man. Lacy was kind and warm and sweet, but that only made her the kind of governess he wanted for his daughter. Nothing more. When he turned away from the stove, leaving the broth to simmer, he saw that Lacy had left him a hot mug of tea on the table. Chapter 12. So I asked her just what she thought she was doing out of bed when she wasn't better yet. She looked me right in the eyes, serious as can be, and explained that Percival needed to go outside, and that was more important than how she felt. I have to tell you, Emma, I don't know what to do with her half the time. It's not because she's terrible or impertinent, but because she's right. There are many times when we have to sacrifice our comfort for the sake of others. Of course, I took care of the dog and made sure she stayed in bed, but it was the sweetest thing. Emma smiled at her over her cup of tea. I haven't known you very long, Lacy, but I haven't seen you this happy since we arrived. I think you've truly found your calling. You just might be right. Lacy turned her head slightly so she could see Alice, fully recovered from her fever now, coming out to serve rolls of bread. The girl's time at Gray's eating house was one of the few breaks that Lacy got, although she'd lately begun using those hours to catch up on all the housework that needed to be done. Right now, it was time to catch up with her friend. I don't know that I could do it for anyone else, though. Carter Gray is a rather handsome man, you know, Emma noted as she lifted her tea again and gave her a mischievous glance. It's not like that. Lacy quickly corrected her. I'm strictly the governess. If you say so, Emma acknowledged. And what about you? Lacy asked, eager to get the subject off of herself. Have you managed to find employment? I have, actually. I've been doing a little bit of housekeeping for a woman by the name of Mrs. Walsh. Her husband did well with the gold mines, and they've built a beautiful new home. It's quite pleasant, and she doesn't ask for much. Emma looked across the room, and her cheeks turned almost as red as her hair. Lacy had an idea that this didn't have anything to do with her current employment. What is it? She asked. Emma ducked her head closer and spoke in a whisper. Sheriff Whitecotton has just come in. Yes, he's in here quite a lot, Lacy noted, glad to see that the lawman offered Alice a friendly wink instead of a scolding glare. The girl had managed to keep herself out of any real trouble recently, which spoke well of what Lacy was doing for her. I've spoken to him a few times, Emma said, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. I see. You'll have to tell me more about that, later, of course. The door to the eatery burst open just then. A tall man filled the doorframe, backlit by the bright day outside. After a pause, he strode into the room with his shoulders wide and his fists curled at his sides. As he did, Lacy recognized his dark hair and lantern jaw, and her mouth dropped open. Lacy, Roger Bond boomed when he caught sight of her and marched to her table. What are you doing here? She stammered, acutely aware that Roger's entrance had snagged the attention of the other diners. She hadn't even thought about him in weeks. He was a dusty memory in a distant past. But now he stood before her, larger than life. His mouth pinched distastefully. He glanced about the room. I'm here to see you. Get your things. I have a carriage waiting. Excuse me? Her heart hammered in her chest and her cheeks flamed red. He cleared his throat uncomfortably. He leaned over, his voice low. I was wrong to let you go. I'd like you to come back to Boston with me. Movement on her periphery drew her eyes. It was Alice watching the debacle, eyes wide. It was just the reminder Lacy needed to pull on her composure and keep herself in check. Roger. I think perhaps we should speak of this in private and at another time, as I'm currently engaged. She gestured to Emma as her excuse. Emma was frozen solid in her chair as she stared up at the man. Don't put me off, Lacy, Roger ground out. I don't have time for it. I've come here to claim you as mine at my expense. It took me days to get here. Let's go. His eyes darted about the room and paused a moment. Lacy followed the look. Carter stood next to Alice, quietly watching the exchange. Roger carried on, oblivious to the undercurrents floating around the diner. You know I'm a busy man. Your sister was far too demanding and spoiled. I'd never truly intended to marry her anyway. That was just a ploy to get you back, and I'm afraid it backfired on me. But I'm gentleman enough to admit it to you, and I know you're lady enough to understand. He thudded one hand down on the back of an empty chair at their table, making it shudder. Lacy swallowed, unsure of exactly what she should do now. He had aired all of their private business right here in front of everyone, revealing facts that she felt were embarrassing and shameful. Sheriff Whitecotton was watching with a keen eye, waiting to see if he needed to do anything about this. She kept her voice steady and her eyes level with the street. "We'll talk another time." "Roger, I can't wait around, Lacy. I've already told you that. I want you back, so it's time to go." He gestured toward the door as though she were a dog. Carter crossed the room. Lacy turned to look at him. She'd wanted to keep this shameful past hidden, but Roger had inadvertently spilled her deepest secret. Carter's jaw was rigid and his back straight. Lacy had never seen him look quite like that, not even when he was upset with Alice. "Sir, you're welcome to buy a meal if you're hungry, or to warm yourself by the fire like anyone else, but you're bothering folks enjoying their food." Sheriff Whitecotton stalked up behind Carter to reinforce his statement. His eyes flicked to Emma for just a moment, but otherwise, he kept his gaze on Roger. "This is private business," Roger remarked. "Kindly stay out of it." "I believe she asked you to save it until another time," Carter's voice hardened. Lacy wanted the ground to swallow her whole. She pushed her chair back and rose, catching Alice's gaze as she did. "Roger, just leave. There is a hotel at the train station. They usually have a spare room there." Roger snorted. "I am not staying here in the boondocks." "That's quite enough," Lacy snapped, and she had the pleasure of seeing surprise slide over Roger's handsome visage. "This is Mr. Gray. He owns this eating house. I also work for him, teaching his young daughter over there." Incredulity moved to amusement, and he let out a rich, rolling laugh. "It's true, then. You've actually lowered yourself to being the hired help because you can't get a man." He shook his hands before she could say another word and began to back away. "Fine, fine. But know this. No wife of mine will be allowed to work, so make your peace with that before we talk again." With another laugh and his thumbs in his belt loops, Roger walked out the door. Stunned silence reigned for a moment before the diners resumed their conversations. The sound was like a wave that slammed her. Lacy caught the glares that they sent at his back, and it seemed that they were happy that he had gone. Lacy looked up. Carter's chest was heaving, and his eyes were wild. His eyes were turbulent, and his mouth worked as though he were trying to find something to say. "I'll be in the kitchen." He finally spluttered before turning on his heel. "Prosody rate." Sheriff Whitecotton tugged the brim of his hat. "It's nice to see you, Miss Snyder." Emma dipped her head. "You too." When he had gone, she turned with wide eyes to Lacy. "You don't even have to tell me for me to know that's him, the one you were going to marry." "Yes," Lacy replied dully, eyes on the swing doors of the kitchen. "To come out here all the way from Boston. I'd say that's romantic if you hadn't already told me everything else he'd done." Emma clucked her tongue. "My goodness, I don't think Carter liked that very much." "I had the same impression." She deliberately brought her attention to her teacup, the brown liquid now tepid. She pushed it away, her stomach roiling with nausea. She would deal with Roger, with his ridiculous words, but right now, her focus was on the man who'd taken up more than a little room in her heart. The diners were eating again. The world was going on around her, but she hardly knew how to join in. Chapter 13. The routine of the Gray household was one that Lacy had come to take comfort in. She rose early every morning to make sure that Percival was taken care of and that Alice had a proper breakfast. The girl herself was still a bit of a challenge, often squirming as Lacy showed her how to do her hair, or sighing as Lacy discussed what clothes would be appropriate for the day. The process was slowly smoothing out, though, and Lacy could rely on the calm tranquility of running a small household. She cleaned and took care of the home while Alice helped at the eating house, and in the afternoon they worked on embroidery or the piano or any other pursuit that held Alice's attention for more than a few minutes. It had become quite the perfect situation for Lacy, up until Roger had shown up in town. Now, Lacy went through her day on tenterhooks, waiting for something else to happen. Roger Bond was the sort of man who was used to getting what he wanted, and he didn't settle for anything less. He'd said back at the eating house that they would talk later. When would that be? She had her mouth in a hard line as she bent to grab a pair of stockings from Alice's floor. "Are you angry?" Alice asked. "Hmm?" Lacy met her eyes, ones that were often very hard and stubborn. Right now, they were inquisitive, perhaps even concerned. The last thing Lacy wanted was for her own emotional turmoil to disturb her charge's life. She turned to put the stockings in the hamper. "No, dear, I was just thinking. About that awful man?" It wasn't as though she'd be able to avoid the conversation forever. "I'm sorry you had to see that. Roger was very impertinent, trying to speak to me in public like that." Some of the stoniness had come back to Alice's eyes. "If you ask me, he shouldn't be able to talk to you like that no matter where you are. He ought to have a little bit more respect." It was almost amusing to see such indignance come out of such a small girl. "I suppose so, but he's got quite a standing in society. He's wealthy and influential, and people usually give him what he wants." "Pfft! Ladies don't make noises like that, Alice." "I think ladies should make noises like that when someone is being as rude as that buffoon Roger was." Lacy should remind her of the choice of words, but right now, that was the politest word she would have chosen herself. Roger Bond was a buffoon. Alice had been sitting in her window seat with a book open on her lap. Now she put it down without even marking her place and hopped to the floor. "Everyone says that children should respect their elders, and a woman is supposed to respect her husband. But why shouldn't someone like him have to follow the same rules? It doesn't seem very fair." She wanted to agree, but it was much more complicated than that. "There's an awful lot in life that isn't fair, my dear." "I know." Alice's face went a little more cloudy than usual. This, Lacy knew, was when she was thinking about her mother. It cleared a moment later as she pushed those thoughts away. "That doesn't mean we shouldn't do everything we can to make it better for others where we can." This girl was going to be quite the challenge for any man who decided to marry her in the future, but Lacy knew she'd never be tamed, not even by some overbearing man like Roger, and she was glad for it. "I think you just might be right, Alice." The girl's eyes lit up like a starry sky as she grinned. "Do you think so?" Poor Alice. She was so misunderstood, and others hardly ever actually listened to what she had to say, much less acknowledged that she was a good judge of character. "I do. Right now, though, I think you need to finish picking up this room. I'm going to stoke the fire in the parlor, so it'll be warm for when your father comes home." Heading downstairs, Lacy felt lighter and happier than she had since Roger had shown up. Alice was an amazing young woman, and she was lucky to have fallen out with Roger and ended up here. She had just started humming happily to herself when a knock resounded through the hall. Glancing up to see the big shadow covering the entryway, Lacy felt all of that happiness drain completely out of her. This was it. Taking a deep breath and lifting her chin, Lacy composed herself and went to the door. "Roger, I don't." "So this is the place?" He practically shoved her aside as he stepped into the hallway and looked around. He peeked into the parlor and frowned. "It's not terrible, I suppose, for being out in the middle of nowhere, but it's a hovel compared to what you'll have when you come back to Boston. Are your things packed?" The idea of having him in here, in a place she'd come to think of as her home, was repulsive. Percival, standing near the stairs, obviously thought the same thing. He began growling angrily. Lacy felt the same sentiment. Still, she was a lady. "No, they're not. Now, Roger, I think—" "Well then, get on with it. I want to get out of this little mining town and back to civilization as quickly as possible." "I don't know why you've punished yourself quite so severely by coming out here, but it's too late to change that now. Don't even bother packing. Just get your coat, and I'll buy you everything new once we get back home." He wrapped his fingers around her wrist and pulled her toward the door. "Stop it." Lacy planted her feet and grabbed the newel post for good measure. Percival skittered around her skirt, trying to find a way to help. Roger was far stronger than she was, and he could have thrown her over his shoulder without incident if he chose, but he was shocked enough that he turned to look at her with surprise. He quickly masked it with a smile. "What's this? You're not really going to stay here, are you?" The small shuffle of footsteps filled Lacy with dread. Alice had heard. She'd crept out onto the landing. Roger's confrontation at the eatery had already been more than a young girl ought to be exposed to, and it was completely wrong that she should hear this now. But Lacy had no choice. "Yes, Roger, I am staying here, And if you would close your mouth and open your ears for even one moment, you would understand that. No, don't you say a word." She held her finger up as his mouth opened, and she scolded him like a naughty child. "It's my turn to speak. I've put up with far more from you than any decent person should be made to suffer. You mistreated me while we were engaged, and you humiliated me when I wouldn't tolerate it. You acted like you were the injured party when I saw your deceit with my own eyes. I withstood your behavior even as you flaunted my sister in front of me to add salt to the wound. It was bad enough that I had to endure that sort of treatment from you, but then I had to endure it from my family as well. You're a buffoon, Roger Bond, an intolerant and cretinous," Alice offered. "Cretinous." Lacy crowed and clapped her hands. "Thank you, Alice. Yes, a cretinous snake who just slithered in here, expecting to snap your fingers, and I would swoon in a heap because it was you doing the finger snapping." "Now see here," Roger began. "I'm speaking." She knew she looked just like Alice as she drew herself up to her full height and stamped her foot for emphasis. Her heart thundered in her chest and her blood was singing in her veins. "You don't get to talk to me like that anymore, Roger. You don't get to talk to me at all, as far as I'm concerned. There was a time when I wanted to be with you, but that's all over now. I'm truly happy here. There's no judgment or accusations, and I don't have to worry about what anyone here thinks of me. I'm surrounded by wonderful people who treat me as a person and not just a token that might get them further along in life. Nobody has ordered me about like a dog." His face was turning from red to purple. "I never." "Oh, yes, yes, you did. You care only for yourself. The only reason you even admitted to making a mistake with Polly is that nobody from Boston's elite is here to witness you saying so. I do not doubt in my mind that as soon as I set foot in Boston, you'd lord it over me and carry on with those poor maids who have to suffer in silence. Don't think for 1 second that I'd want to have anything to do with you, now or ever. Now get out, Roger, and don't you dare darken my doorstep once more." Lacy pointed one long, straight finger at the door. Roger's mouth pursed, and he clenched his hands into tight fists. His eyes were hard and full of rage. She watched as he debated the option of ignoring her. He took a step towards her, but stopped when Carter's voice cut through the tension. "Don't even think about it, buddy. You heard the lady. Out." "Fine," he finally managed to grind out. "But you'll regret this, Lacy." "I highly doubt it." She marched forward to shut and lock the door behind him. She watched him through the glass as he stomped across the yard. When he was out of sight, she turned with relief and sagged against the doorway. Alice and Carter watched her, their expressions in direct contrast with each other. Alice stood near the top of the stairs, looking absolutely thrilled. Her grin spread from ear to ear, and her eyes glittered. Carter was in the hallway, and Lacy realized he must have come in through the back door during her tirade. Her righteous, angry tirade left her feeling exhausted and drained. She felt the sudden rush of heat to her cheeks. She refused to cry over Roger, but what about the fact that the two people she'd come to care deeply about knew the depth to which she'd been humiliated? Her language had been atrocious, and she'd shown herself up spectacularly. She'd brought trouble to their door. How could she ever face them again? "I'm sorry," she managed. "Excuse me." Sweeping up the stairs with Percival behind her, Lacy headed into her room and shut the door. Chapter 14. "Did you see that?" Alice asked, beaming as she bounced down the stairs. Miss Lacy told him, didn't she? Carter was still trying to understand what he'd just witnessed. He'd gleaned quite a bit of information about his mysterious houseguest when that man had come to the eating house, information that hadn't been relevant up until that point. He'd been more than ready to jump in and say something, but it hadn't been needed. "Yes, darling," he finally muttered. "I did. And did you see Roger's face? He didn't even know what to do." Alice jumped off the last 2 steps, her skirts fanning out around her. "No, he certainly didn't. Alice, why don't you run along and play outside for a while? I need to talk to Miss Lacy." A heaviness had settled in his chest because he knew what he had to do. "You're not going to let her go, are you?" Alice grabbed fistfuls of his jacket in her hands, her eyes wide and desperate. "Please don't. She's always a lady, other than now, and that man deserved it. I don't want her to leave. Darling, please. Carter carefully and gently extricated her. Go play, and you and I will talk later. Alice stalked out of the house, muttering about how now she was allowed to be outside when he'd told her to stay in for months. Stay on the property, Alice, he called out. His response was the door slamming. Slowly, he ascended the stairs. This wasn't going to be easy. Not at all, but it had to be done, and perhaps it was better to get it over with instead of waiting around for a better moment. He lifted a fist to knock gently. Lacy? Faint shuffling could be heard behind the door, as well as sniffling. Yes? I'd like to talk to you, please. A moment later, the door opened. Lacy's face was red. Her hair had become a bit disheveled, and the room behind her had as well. Her valise was open on the bed, ready to receive everything from the small wardrobe. Percival was frolicking among some of the dresses that had draped down off the side of the bed. I'll spare you from saying anything, she said as she looked at him with somber eyes. I know that what I've done is terrible. You hired me so that I could show Alice what it meant to be a lady. I like to think I've made a lot of progress on that front, but I undid all of it in the span of 5 minutes. I shouldn't have behaved like that, and I completely understand that you'll be letting me go. It won't take me long, and I'll be out of here soon. Lacy turned from him to continue her packing. It felt so personal to be here in her room with her, and he only stepped just inside the door. His heart lurched like a rock in a tin can. And where would you go? Back to Miss Betty's for the time being, I suppose. I'm not sure after that. She took Percival's extra leash off a hook and packed it into the bag. I truly am sorry for my behavior. Carter cleared his throat, which was becoming tighter by the moment. On the contrary, I don't think I've ever seen you act more like a lady than you did just now. Her shoulders dropped as she looked up at him. You can't mean that. I do. Carter dared to take another step toward her. I don't know Roger Bond, and I can't claim to know all of what had transpired between the two of you. What is clear to me is that he needed someone to put him in his place. Confusion swept over her features as she straightened. I can't say that I completely disagree with you. Roger was a horrible man, and I'm lucky to have gotten away from him. I just wish that it hadn't all happened the way it did, in front of Alice. Carter nodded. In a way, I agree. In a way, I don't. Alice has been a difficult child. There's no mistaking that. She's willful and stubborn, and she sees things differently than most people do. You have been one of her staunchest allies since you arrived here, coaxing her out of her shell and getting her to trust you. I also think, however, that it did her a lot of good to see someone she looks up to stand up for herself so much, just the way she should in that situation. I would have hushed her when she spoke, but instead, you allowed her to aid you. Lacy looked down at her open valise. You don't intend to keep me on as her governess, though. It was a statement, not a question. He pulled in a breath and found that his lungs refused to hold enough air. No, I don't. She nodded and added a hairbrush to her bag. I'd rather hope to keep you here in a different capacity, he said. Her brows knotted as she looked up. I? What do you mean? Instead, I'd rather you stayed on as my wife. The words were out of his mouth, and he couldn't take them back now. Carter moved across the room, daring to come closer to her. Lacy, I thought for a long time that I could never love another woman after Anne died. I don't think I even wanted to, and so it took me a while to realize that what I felt for you was more than just respect and appreciation for what you've done here with Alice and for the house. For me, he added, knowing that he'd benefited just as much as his daughter. I know that it had to be difficult for you when Roger showed up the way he did at the eatery, he pushed on. Seeing him talk to you like that raised an ire in me that I didn't even know I had. I couldn't stand the idea of him speaking to you like that, nor the idea of you going back to Boston with him. She blinked at him as she took her step forward. You were jealous? Yes, he admitted. I suppose I was. I just didn't know what to do about it, not at first. You've come to mean so much to me, Lacy. I know you won't be going back east with Roger, but I don't want to think about you going anywhere with anybody but me. I love you, and I hope that you might find some way to love me back. Tears glimmered in her eyes, her dark lashes spiking to frame her pretty eyes. Carter, I had no idea that you felt that way. I suppose I should admit that I've fallen for you as well. It was the small things, seeing the gentleness when you talk to Alice, or how much compassion you have for those who are hungry. You're both strong and gentle, a quality that makes you more than I ever could have asked for in a husband. He pulled her into his arms. It felt so right to have her there, and he couldn't understand how he'd gone so long without telling her how he'd felt. Carter had known right from the start that she was sweet and beautiful, but now also knew that she was also generous of heart and had a strong will that would match his fiery daughter. "Does that mean you'll marry me, Lacy?" She smiled at him. "Yes, I will. I mean, as long as Alice approves, of course." His heart soared. Even in such a moment, she still cared so much for Alice. She would be the perfect mother. "Of course." Percival barked excitedly, his curly little tail wagging. He wiggled his way between them to sit on their feet, looking up at both of them with glee. Carter laughed. "I can see that Percival approves, which is a good start. Now let's go see what Alice thinks." He entwined his fingers with hers, kissed the back of her hand, and led the way downstairs. Epilogue. "Oh, she's just the most darling little thing." Emma clasped her hands under her chin as she leaned over the cradle. Lacy swelled with pride as she did every time someone came to visit, and there had been quite a few of them. Though she'd known many people back in Boston, she doubted that their good wishes would have been quite so sincere if she'd started her family there. "Thank you. I just can't stop looking at her. She's got Carter's eyes, I think." Emma nodded approvingly. "I do believe you're right. May I hold her?" "Of course. We'll take her down into the parlor. I need a little time out of the nursery anyway. We can have some tea. You don't think she'll fuss?" Emma looked down at the tiny face as baby Hannah squirmed and then settled into her arms. "No," Lacy said with a smile. "She'd freshly fed and changed for one thing. I also think she's rather a good baby. I do spend a lot of time with her, of course, but she's been easy so far. It doesn't hurt that I have a wonderful little helper." They made their way carefully down to the parlor, where Emma insisted on helping with the tea. Percival followed them down and took his usual place on the hearth. "Alice isn't jealous? I know that can happen sometimes with older siblings." Lacy moved slowly, her body still recovering from the miracle of having a child of her own, as she fetched the sugar bowl. "It's rather the opposite. Alice is fascinated with her little sister, and she helps her all the time. I need only to think that I need a fresh diaper or some powder, and Alice is right there. I'm so proud of both of my girls." Warmth flooded through her, though it was already getting cold outside once again. The spring and summer had gone by quickly as she and Carter had gotten married and adjusted to their new lives as husband and wife instead of employer and governess. Lacy looked forward to getting the girls out into the garden when it got warm again, giving them time to play and enjoy the sunshine. "You certainly look it," Emma agreed, "and it suits you. I can only hope that I'll be as happy as you are." "You'll need to find yourself a husband first." Lacy sat down as Emma set the tea tray on the table. "Or is there something you want to tell me about that?" Emma had been smiling ever since she arrived, but now she beamed. "I wanted to wait until I knew everything was well with you before I said anything. I didn't want to give you any excitement you couldn't handle." "Tell me," Lacy urged, seeing that her friend had some wonderful news to share. The two of them had become so close ever since Arthur Davies had tricked them into coming out to Colorado, something that seemed far in the past now. Emma's cheeks flushed a pretty shade of pink, and her eyelashes fluttered as she poured the tea. "I'm engaged to Sheriff Whitecotton. Well, I suppose I ought to call him Jake now." "Oh, Emma, that's absolutely wonderful." She hugged her friend as even more warmth and happiness flooded over her. "I can't believe we've both been so lucky." "I know," Emma admitted. "I just know the two of us are going to be so happy together, and hopefully we'll be lucky enough to have a little one to play with Hannah and Alice." "I'm sure you will. You let me know whatever I can do to help with the wedding." Emma finished her cup of tea. "It won't be until spring. We want to wait until the worst of the weather is over, but it's difficult. I don't want to sound spoiled, but I'd marry him tomorrow if I could." Considering how short of a time it was between her and Carter's engagement and their actual nuptials, Lacy completely understood. Prosody rate percent. Winter will pass quickly enough, especially with something so wonderful to look forward to, she assured her. I do hope you're right. Emma stood and gave one last wistful glance at Hannah. I'd better get going. I've got some other errands I need to run today. I'll walk you out. They reached the door just as Carter and Alice came bustling in from the cold. Emma, I heard there are congratulations in order, he said as he took off his hat. She flushed once again. Word really gets around here, doesn't it? You can't marry a man like Sheriff Whitecotton without everyone knowing. I wish you all the best. Thank you. Ma, there was a package for you at the post office, Alice announced, holding up a parcel wrapped in brown paper. The excitement of a package was far exceeded by the way Lacy felt every time Alice referred to her as Mama. Neither she nor Carter had asked it of her, but she'd started doing it almost from the moment Carter and Lacy were officially married. A package? I wasn't expecting anything. Carter gave her a knowing look. It's from Boston. Where's Hannah? Alice asked as she handed the parcel over. In the parlor. She didn't even need to ask if Alice would keep an eye on her. The girl was darting off to check on her younger sister. She's really something, Carter said as he hung up his coat and glanced toward the parlor doors. The entire day, she's done nothing but chatter about all of the things she's doing to teach Hannah. I told her she might need to at least wait until she is old enough to sit up. Who's it from? He jutted a chin toward the package as he put an arm around her waist. My parents. Lacy's fingers shook slightly as she pulled away the twine. There had been plenty of hard feelings between them when she'd left Boston, but Lacy had still written to announce her wedding, her coming child, and Hannah's arrival. The brown paper fell away to reveal a baby blanket knitted in yellow, as well as a bright green hat and scarf in a larger size. There's a note. She lifted the folded paper while Carter relieved her of the rest. Lacy skimmed it over before she read it to him. We're happy to hear that you finally found all of the peace and happiness that you deserve. I know that I should have handled things differently when you were here, and I'm sorry for it. I can only hope that we can continue in the future with a better relationship than we've had in the past. I picked up my knitting needles for the first time in ages to make a blanket for our newest grandchild. I haven't yet had the chance to meet Alice, but I thought she might like the green for the hat and scarf. That was always one of your favorite colors when you were that age. Love, Mother. Carter kissed her cheek as tears ran down it. That's wonderful, darling. Yes, she had to agree, finding her handkerchief and dabbing at her tears. Lacy thought she already had everything she needed or wanted, but this letter and gift from her mother had made it all infinitely better. Let's go give the girls their gifts. Carter opened the door quietly when he heard the soft crooning on the other side. Lacy met his excited grin and laid a finger against his lips as they lingered in the doorway. Alice had her back turned to them as she bent over the cradle. I know it's a long time to wait until it's warm outside, but we'll have all sorts of adventures when it is. You'll have to try to keep your clothes clean because it makes Mama happy. And when you're old enough, you can come to work at the eating house with me. Well, perhaps you can. I'm back in school now, so I haven't had much time to go there. I sort of miss it. I didn't think I did, but there are a lot of interesting people. Lacy leaned into Carter's embrace as she listened to Alice chatter on. She had wanted her life to change at one point. She'd certainly found that change, but in more ways than she'd ever imagined. Lacy couldn't imagine it being any better than this. The end.